Among the Eskimo at the other end of the American continent, according to Dr. F. Cook, the sexual passions are suppressed during the long darkness of winter, as also is the menstrual function usually, and the majority of the children are born 9 months after the appearance of the sun. Among the Indians of North America, it is the custom of many tribes to refrain from sexual intercourse during the whole period of lactation, as also d'Orbigny found to be the case among South American Indians. Although suckling went on for over 3 years, many of the Indian tribes have now been rendered licentious by contact with civilization in the primitive condition. Their customs were entirely different. Dr. Holder, who knows many tribes of North American Indians well, has dealt, in some detail, with this point several of the virtues he states, and among them chastity were more faithfully practiced by the Indian race before the invasion from the East than these same virtues are practiced by the white race of the present day. The race is less salacious than either the Negro or white race, that the women of some tribes are now more careful of their virtue than the women of any other community whose history I know. I am fully convinced it is not only on the women that sexual abstinence is imposed among some branches of the Salish Indians of British Columbia. A young widower must refrain from sexual intercourse for a year, and sometimes lives entirely apart during that period. In many parts of Polynesia, although the sexual impulse seems often to have been highly developed before the arrival of Europeans, it is very doubtful whether license in the European sense at all generally prevailed. The Marquesans, who have sometimes been regarded as peculiarly licentious, are especially mentioned by Foley as illustrating his statement that sexual erethism is with difficulty attained by primitive peoples, except during sexual seasons. Herman Melville's detailed account in Type of the Marquesans, somewhat idealized, no doubt reveals nothing that can fairly be called licentiousness. At Rotuma, J. Stanley Gardner remarks, before the missionaries came sexual intercourse before marriage was free, but gross immorality and prostitution and adultery were unknown matters are much worse now. The Maoris of New Zealand in the old days, according to one who had lived among them, were more chaste than the English, and though a chief might lend his wife to a friend, as an honor it would be very difficult to take her private communication. Captain Cook also represented these people as modest and virtuous. Among the Papuans of New Guinea and Torres Straits, although intercourse before marriage is free, it is by no means unbridled, nor is it carried to excess. There are many circumstances restraining intercourse. Thus unmarried men must not indulge in it during October and November at Torres Straits. It is the general rule also that there should be no sexual intercourse during pregnancy while a child is being suckled, which goes on for 3 or 4 years or even until it can speak or walk. In Astrolabe Bay, New Guinea, according to Vaughanis, a young couple must abstain from intercourse for several weeks after marriage, and to break this rule would be disgraceful. As regards Australia, Smythe wrote, promiscuous intercourse between the sexes is not practiced by the Aborigines, and their laws on the subject, particularly those of New South Wales, are very strict. When at camp, all the young unmarried men are stationed by themselves at the extreme end, while the married men, each with his family, occupy the center. No conversation is allowed between the single men and the girls, or the married women. Infractions of these laws were visited by punishment. 5 or 6 warriors threw for comparatively short distance several spears at him. The offender, the man, was often severely wounded and sometimes killed. This author mentions that a black woman has been known to kill a white man who attempted to have intercourse with her by force, yet both sexes have occasional sexual intercourse from an early age after marriage. In various parts of Australia, there are numerous restraints on intercourse, which is forbidden not merely during menstruation, but during the latter part of pregnancy, and for 1 moon after childbirth. Concerning the people of the Malay Peninsula, H. Rolfe Vaughan Stevens states the sexual impulse among the Belendas is only developed to a slight extent. They are not sensual, and the husband has intercourse with his wife not oftener than 3 times a month. The women also are not ardent. The Orang Laut are more sensual than the Dyaks, who are however more given to obscene jokes than their neighbors. With the Belendas there is little or no love play in sexual relations. Skeet tells us also that among Malays in wartime strict chastity must be observed in a stockade, or the bullets of the garrison will lose their power. It is a common notion that the Negro and Negroid races of Africa are peculiarly prone to sexual indulgence. This notion is not supported by those who have had the most intimate knowledge of these peoples. It probably gained currency in part, owing to the open and expansive temperament of the Negro, and in part owing to the extremely sexual character of many African orgies and festivals, though those might quite as legitimately be taken as evidence of difficulty in attaining sexual erethism. A French army surgeon speaking from knowledge of the black races in various French colonies states in his Untrodden Fields of Anthropology that it is a mistake to imagine that the negress is very amorous. She is rather cold and indifferent to the refinements of love, in which respects she is very unlike the mulatto. The white man is usually powerless to excite her, partly from his small penis, partly from his rapidity of emission. The black man, on account of his blunter nervous system, takes 3 times as long to reach emission as the white man. Among the Mohammedan peoples of West Africa, Daniel remarks, as well as in Central and Northern Africa, it is usual to suckle a child for 2 or more years, from the time when pregnancy becomes apparent to the end of weaning. No intercourse takes place. It is believed that this would greatly endanger the infant, if not destroy it. This means that for every child the woman, at all events, must remain continent for about 3 years. Sir H. H. Johnston, writing concerning the peoples of Central Africa, remarks that the man also must remain chaste during these periods. Thus among the Atonga, the wife leaves her husband at the 6th month of pregnancy and does not resume relations with him until 5 or 6 months after the birth of the child. If in the interval he has relations with any other woman, it is believed his wife will certainly die. The Negro is very rarely vicious, Johnston says, after he has attained to the age of puberty. He is only more or less uxorious. The children are vicious, as they are among most races of mankind. The boys, outrageously so as regards the little girls. Over nearly the whole of British Central Africa, chastity before puberty is an unknown condition, except perhaps among the Anyanya. Before a girl is become a woman, it is a matter of absolute indifference what she does, and scarcely any girl remains a virgin after about 5 years of age. Among the Bangala of the Upper Congo, a woman suckles her child for 6 to 18 months, and during all this period, the husband has no intercourse with his wife, for that, it is believed, would kill the child. Among the Yoruba-speaking people of West Africa, A.B. Ellis mentions that suckling lasts for 3 years, during the whole of which period the wife must not cohabit with her husband. Although chastity before marriage appears to be as a rule little regarded in Africa, this is not always so in some parts of West Africa. A girl, at all events, if of high birth, when found guilty of unchastity, may be punished by the insertion into her vagina of bird pepper, a kind of capsicum beaten into a mass. This produces intense pain and such acute inflammation that the canal may even be obliterated. Among the Dahomey women, there is no coitus during pregnancy, nor during suckling, which lasts for nearly 3 years. The same is true among the Jekris and other tribes on the Niger, where it is believed that the milk would suffer if intercourse took place during lactation. In another part of Africa, among the Suaheli, even after marriage, only incomplete coitus is at first allowed, and there is no intercourse for a year after the child's birth. Farther south, among the Bawenda of North Transvaal, says the Rev. R. Westman, although the young men are permitted to play with the young girls before marriage, no sexual intercourse is allowed. If it is seen that a girl's labia are apart when she sits down on a stone, she is scolded or even punished as guilty of having had intercourse. Among the higher races in India, the sexual instinct is very developed, and sexual intercourse has been cultivated as an art, perhaps more elaborately than anywhere else. Here, however, we are far removed from primitive conditions, and among a people closely allied to the Europeans farther to the east. As among the Cambodians, strict chastity seems to prevail, and if we cross the Himalayas to the north, we find ourselves among wild people to whom sexual license is unknown. Thus among the Turkomans, even a few days after the marriage has been celebrated, the young couple are separated for an entire year. All the great organized religions have seized on this value of sexual abstinence, already consecrated by primitive magic and religion, and embodied it in their system. It was so in ancient Egypt. Thus, according to Diodorus, on the death of a king, the entire population of Egypt abstained from sexual intercourse for 72 days. The Persians again attached great value to sexual as to all other kinds of purity. Even involuntary seminal emissions were severely punishable. To lie with a menstruating woman, according to the Vendidad, was as serious a matter as to pollute holy fire, and to lie with a pregnant woman was to incur a penalty of 2,000 strokes among the modern Parsis. A man must not lie with his wife after she is 4 months and 10 days pregnant. Mohammedanism cannot be described as an ascetic religion, yet long and frequent periods of sexual abstinence are enjoined. There must be no sexual intercourse during the whole of pregnancy, during suckling, during menstruation, and for 8 days before and after, nor during the 30 days of the Ramadan fast. Other times of sexual abstinence are also prescribed. Thus, among the Mohammedan Yazidis of Mardin in northern Mesopotamia, there must be no sexual intercourse on Wednesdays or Fridays. In the early Christian Church, many rules of sexual abstinence still prevailed, similar to those usual among savages, though not for such prolonged periods. In Egbert's Penitential, belonging to the 9th century, it is stated that a woman must abstain from intercourse with her husband 3 months after conception, and for 40 days after birth. There were a number of other occasions, including Lent, when a husband must not know his wife. Some canonists say, remarks Jeremy Taylor, that the Church forbids a mutual congregation of married pairs upon festival days. The Council of Illiberis commanded abstinence from conjugal rites for 3 or 4 or 7 days before the communion. Pope Liberius commanded the same during the whole time of Lent, supposing the fast is polluted by such congregations. A Sutherland Origin and Growth of the Moral Instinct, Vol. IPP 887, as has been shown by, for instance, Dr. Ewan Bloch Beitridge zur Theologie der Psychopathia Sexualis Erster Thale 1902, every perverse sexual practice may be found somewhere or other among savages or barbarians. But as the same writer acutely points out, p. 58, these devices bear witness to the need of overcoming frigidity rather than to the strength of the sexual impulse. Ploss and Bartels have brought together in Des Weib a large number of facts in the same sense, more especially under the headings of Abstinenz Vorschriften and Die Fernhaltung der Schwangeren. I have not drawn upon their collection. Journal of the Anthropological Institute, May 1896, p. 369. Heides and Denneker Mission, Scientifique du Cap Horn, Vol. Roman 7, p. 188. F. Cook, New York Journal of Gynecology and Obstetrics, 1894. Adi Orbigny El Ham Americain, 1839, Vol. IP 47. A. B. Holder, Gynesic Notes Among the American Indians, American Journal of Obstetrics, 1892, Vol. Roman 26, No. 1. Journal of the Anthropological Institute, 1905, p. 139. Foley Bulletin de la Société d'Anthropologie, Paris, November 6, 1879. J. S. Gardner, Journal of the Anthropological Institute, February 1898, p. 409. As regards the modern Maoris, a medical correspondent in New Zealand writes, "It is nothing for members of both sexes to live in the same room, and for promiscuous intercourse to take place between father and daughter or brother and sister Maori women, who will display a great deal of modesty when in the presence of male Maoris, will openly ask strange Europeans to have sexual intercourse with them, and without any desire for reward. The men, however, seem to prefer their own women, and even when staying in towns where they can obtain prostitutes, they will remain continent until they return home again, a period of perhaps a month." Schellong Zeitschrift für Ethnologie, 1889, IPP 1719, Haddon Journal of the Anthropological Institute, February 1890, pp. 316, 397, Guys Ib, February, and May 1899, p. 207, Seligman, Ib 1902, pp. 298, 301,302, Reports Cambridge Expedition, Vol. V, pp. 190, 9,200, 275. Zeitschrift für Ethnologie 1900, HTVP 414. Arbor Smythe, The Aborigines of Victoria, Vol. Roman 2, p. 318. Journal of the Anthropological Institute, 1894, pp. 170, 177, 187. Zeitschrift für Ethnologie, 1896, Roman 4, pp. 180,181. W. W. Skeet Malay Magic, p. 524. W. F. Daniel, Medical Topography of Gulf of Guinea, 1849, p. 55. Sir H. H. Johnston, British Central Africa, 1899, pp. 409, 414. Rev. J. H. Weeks Journal of the Anthropological Institute, 1910, p. 418. Sir A. B. Ellis Yoruba Speaking Peoples p. 185. W. F. Daniel Op. Cit. p. 36. Journal of the Anthropological Institute, August and November 1898 p. 106. Zeitschrift für Ethnologie 1899 Roman 2, and Roman 3 p. 84 Welten sitten, und Gebrauch der Suaheli p. 12. Zeitschrift für Ethnologie 1896 p. 364. Vambury Travels in Central Asia, 1864 p. 323. Herd Journal of the Anthropological Institute, Jan-June 1911 p. 210. The same rule is also observed by the Christians of this district. Haddon and Stubbs Councils and Ecclesiastical Documents, Vol. Roman 3 p. 423. Jeremy Taylor The Rule of Conscience BK Roman 3 ch. Roman 4 Rule Roman 20 Roman 3. Thus it would seem probable that contrary to a belief, once widely prevalent, the sexual instinct has increased rather than diminished with the growth of civilization. This fact was clear to the insight of Lucretius, though it has often been lost sight of since, yet even observation of animals might have suggested the real bearing of the facts. The higher breeds of cattle, it is said, require the male more often than the inferior breeds. Thoroughbred horses soon reach sexual maturity. And I understand that since pains have been taken to improve cart horses, the sexual instincts of the mares have become less trustworthy. There is certainly no doubt that in our domestic animals, generally which live under what may be called civilized conditions, the sexual system and the sexual needs are more developed than in the wild species most closely related to them. All observers seem to agree on this point, and it is sufficient to refer to the excellent summary of the question furnished by Heap in the study of the sexual season of mammals, to which reference has already been made. He remarks, moreover, that while the sexual activity of domestic animals and of wild animals in captivity may be more frequently exhibited, it is not so violent as is shown by animals in the wild state, so that it would seem the greater periodicity of the instinct in the wild state, alike in animals and in man, is associated with greater violence of the manifestations when they do appear. Certain rodents, such as the rat and the mouse, are well known to possess both great reproductive power and marked sexual proclivities. Heap suggests that this also is due to the advantages derived from their intimate relations with the luxuries of civilization. Heap recognizes that as regards reproductive power, the same development may be traced in man. It would seem highly probable that the reproductive power of man has increased with civilization precisely as it may be increased in the lower animals by domestication, that the effect of a regular supply of good food, together with all the other stimulating factors available and exercised in modern civilized communities, has resulted in such great activity of the generative organs and so great an increase in the supply of the reproductive elements, that conception in the healthy human female may be said to be possible almost at any time during the reproductive period. People of sense and reflection are most apt to have violent and constant passions, wrote Mary Wollstonecraft, and to be preyed on by them. It is that fact which leads to the greater importance of sexual phenomena among the civilized. As compared to savages, the conditions of civilization increase the sexual instinct, which consequently tends to be more intimately connected with moral feelings. Morality is bound up with the development of the sexual instinct, the more casual and periodic character of the impulse in animals, since it involves greater sexual indifference, tends to favor a loose tie between the sexes and hence is not favorable to the development of morals. As we understand morals in man, the ever-present impulse of sex, idealizing each sex to the other sex, draws men and women together and holds them together. Foolish and ignorant persons may deplore the full development which the sexual instinct has reached in civilized man. To a finer insight, that development is seen to be indissolubly linked with all that is most poignant and most difficult indeed, but also all that is best in human life as we know it. De Rerum Natura v. 1016. Raciborski Trait de la Menstruation p. 43 quotes the observation of an experienced breeder of choice cattle to this effect. The organs which in the feral state, as Adler's remarks Biologisches Centralblatt, No. 4 1902, quoted in Science, May 16 1902, are continually exercised in a severe struggle for existence, do not under domestication compete so closely with one another for the less needed nutriment. Hence organs like the reproductive glands, which are not so directly implicated in self-preservation, are able to avail themselves of more food. Quarterly Journal of Microscopical Science, Vol. Roman 40, 4, 1900 p. 12, 30, 139. Love in Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. Appendix B. The development of the sexual instinct. It is a very remarkable fact that although for many years past serious attempts have been made to elucidate the psychology of sexual perversions, little or no endeavor has been made to study the development of the normal sexual emotions. Nearly every writer seems either to take for granted that he and his readers are so familiar with all the facts of normal sex psychology that any detailed statement is altogether uncalled for, or else he is content to write a few fragmentary remarks, mostly made up of miscellaneous extracts from anatomical, philosophical, and historical works. Yet it is as unreasonable to take normal phenomena for granted here as in any other region of science. A knowledge of such phenomena is as necessary here as physiology is to pathology or anatomy to surgery. So far from the facts of normal sex development, sex emotions and sex needs being uniform and constant, as is assumed by those who consider their discussion unnecessary, the range of variation within fairly normal limits is immense, and it is impossible to meet with two individuals whose records are nearly identical. There are two fundamental reasons why the endeavor should be made to obtain a broad basis of clear information on the subject. In the first place, the normal phenomena give the key to the abnormal phenomena, and the majority of sexual perversions, including even those that are most repulsive, are but exaggerations of instincts and emotions that are germinal in normal human beings. In the second place, we cannot even know what is normal until we are acquainted with the sexual life of a large number of healthy individuals. And until we know the limits of normal sexuality, we are not in position to lay down any reasonable rules of sexual hygiene. On these grounds, I have for some time sought to obtain the sexual histories, and more especially the early histories of men and women, who on prima facie grounds may fairly be considered, or are at all events by themselves, and others considered ordinarily healthy and normal. There are many difficulties about such a task, difficulties which are sufficiently obvious. There is first of all the natural reticence to reveal facts of so intimately personal a character. There is the prevailing ignorance and unintelligence, which leads to the phenomena being obscure to the subject himself. When the first difficulty has been overcome, and the second is non-existent, there is still a lack of sufficiently strong motive to undertake the record, as well as a failure to realize the value of such records. I have, however, received a large number of such histories, for the most part offered spontaneously with permission to make such further inquiries as I thought desirable. Some of these histories are extremely interesting and instructive in the present appendix, and in a corresponding appendix to the two following volumes of these studies, I bring forward a varied selection of these narratives. In a few cases, it will be seen the subjects are, to say the least, on the borderland of the abnormal, but they do not come before us as patients desiring treatment. They are playing their usually active, sometimes even distinguished part in the world, which knows nothing of their intimate histories. History Roman 1 et. I reproduce this history written in the third person, as it reached my hands. T.s. earliest recollections of ideas of a sexual character are vaguely associated with thoughts upon whipping, inflicted on companions by their parents, and sometimes upon his own person, about the age of 7. Occasionally depicted to himself the appearance of the bare nates and genitalia of boys during flagellation. Reflection upon whipping gave rise to slight curious sensations at the base of the abdomen, and in the nerves of the sexual system. The sight of a boy being whipped upon the bare nates caused erection before the age of 9. He cannot account for these excitations, as at the time he had not learned the most rudimentary facts of sex. The spectacle of the boy's nudity had no attraction for him, while the beating aroused his indignation against the person who administered it. T knew a boy and girl of about his own age, whose imaginations dwelt somewhat morbidly upon whipping. The three used to talk together about such chastisement, and the little girl liked to read stories that had whippings in them. None of these children delighted in cruelty. The fascination in the theme of castigation seemed to be in imagining the spectacle of the exposed nates, though actual witnessing of the whipping made them angry at the time. Accustomed to watch a young sister being bathed, T had no distinct curiosity concerning the differences in sex until the age of 9. About this time, he asked his father where babies came from, and was told to be quiet when he persisted in the inquiry. His father threatened to box his ears. His mother told him subsequently that doctors brought babies to mothers. He credited the story so far as to carefully watch the doctor who came when his mother was going to have a new baby in the hope of seeing a bundle in his arm. T was 9 when he interrogated a servant girl of 16 about babies and their origin. She laughed and said that one day she would tell him how children came. One Sunday, this servant took T for a country walk and initiated him in sexual intercourse, telling him he was too young to be a father, but that was the way babies were made. The girl took him into a field, saying she would show him how to do something which would make him feel as though he was in heaven, informing him that she had often done this with young men. She then succeeded in causing erection and instructed him how to act. His feeling at the time was one of disgust. The appearance and odor of the female genitalia repelled him. Afterward, however, he wished to repeat the experience with girls of his own age. Finding the boy unresponsive, the girl took the masculine position and embraced him with great passion. T can recall the expression of the girl's face, the perspiration on her forehead, and the whispered query whether it pleased him. The embrace lasted for about 10 minutes when the girl said it had done her good. Later the same day, they met a girl cousin of this servant, about 10 or 12 years old. The three went to a lonely part of the seashore. The servant there suggested that T should repeat the act with the little girl. T was too shy, though the girl seemed quite willing and experienced. The older girl told the younger to keep watch a few yards away, while she again brought about intercourse in the same way. The servant told T not to tell anyone. Intercourse with the servant was never repeated after that day. From shame, he kept the promise for many years. After this episode, T began to speculate about sexual matters and to observe the coupling of dogs with newly acquired interest. At 10 years, he often lay awake listening to a woman of 25 singing to a piano accompaniment. The woman's voice seemed very beautiful and so strongly impressed him that he fell in love with her and longed to embrace her sexually. This secret attachment was much more romantic than sensual, though the idea of embracing the woman seemed to T a natural part of the romance. He was beginning to invest the sex with angelic qualities. The thought of his adventure with the servant no longer caused repulsion, but rather pleasure. He reflected that if he could meet the girl now, he could be very fond of her and understand things better. At this time, he had not masturbated, nor even heard of the practice. One day, while playing with a girl of his own age, he succeeded in overcoming her shyness and induced her to expose herself, at the same time uncovering his own sexual parts on this occasion. And once afterward, he succeeded in penetrating the vulva. Both he and the girl experienced imperfect enjoyment. At boarding school, where he was sent at 10, T learned the vulgar phrases for sexual organs and sexual acts, and acquired the habit of moderate masturbation. Coarse talk and indecent jests about the opposite sex were common amusements of the playroom and dormitories. At first, the obscene conversation was very distasteful. Later, he became more used to it, but thought it strange that sex intimacy should be a subject for ridicule and jest. He began to read love stories and think much about girls. At the same time, he learned the nature of the sin of fornication and wondered why it should be considered so heinous. Parts of the Bible condemning intercourse between the unmarried alarmed him, being of a serious as well as emotional and amorous nature. He became converted to evangelic belief. His mother warned him to beware of unclean companions. At school, he tried to act as a Christian and think only pure thoughts about women. The talk, however, was always of girls and of being in love. His mind was often engrossed with amatory ideas of a poetic, sensuous nature, his sexual experiences having a firm hold on his imagination, while they gave him gratifying assurance of actual knowledge concerning things merely imagined by most of his companions. His health was vigorous, and he keenly enjoyed all outdoor games and excelled in daring and schoolboy mischief. At 12, he fell deeply in love with a girl of corresponding age. He never felt any powerful sexual desire for his sweetheart, and never attempted anything but kissing and decorous caresses. He liked to walk and sit with the girl, to hold her hand and stroke her soft hair. He felt real grief when separated from her. His thoughts of her were seldom sensual. A year or so afterward, he had a temporary passion for a woman of 30 who used to flirt with him and allow kissing. T thought her queen-like and very lovely, and wished to be her knight. One day he saw for a moment in a friend's house a dark, earnest-looking girl of 13 who made a very deep impression upon him, and though he did not exchange a word with her, he often thought about her afterward. 5 years later, He met the dark girl again, and the pair were mutually drawn to one another. He proposed marriage, and avowed a most desperate passion. A refusal on the plea of youth caused him the deepest misery. About 8 years thereafter T married the girl, and the marriage proved a very happy one for both. When he was 15, T made the acquaintance of a pretty blonde of the same age. She was a high-spirited hoyden. They were soon close friends, and later lovers. They wrote a number of letters to each other, and exchanged locks of hair, and presents. Their talk about love was unreserved. One day, she told T that she had been sexually embraced by a former lover, a boy of 16, hinting very plainly that she would like T to embrace her. This amour lasted for about 6 months. The lovers had many opportunities for clandestine intercourse. They used to consummate their passion in a part of a wood they called the bower now, and then one or the other would experience pricking of conscience, but they were too passionately attached to each other to sever the intimacy at length. The girl began to dread the risk of conception, and the intercourse ceased. Looking back upon this episode, T avers that the attachment and its physical expression seemed quite natural, poetic, and beautiful. Though at times his religious principles condemned his conduct, he now thinks that the experience is by no means to be regretted either by the girl or himself. It was a wholesome youthful passion, as innocent as the mating of birds, and the insight which it gave to both of the hidden emotions of human nature was morally advantageous in afterlife. T believes that his amative precocity was due to the early awakening of sex feeling by the servant girl, but he also believes that the love passion would have asserted itself early in any case, since he inherits a warm temperament, had erectile power long before puberty, and has considerable seminal capacity, having closely watched the effects of suppressed normal emotions and desires in youth at the time of pubescence. He maintains that such suppression is disastrous, causing unhealthy thoughts and leading to the formation of a habit of masturbation, which may persist throughout life. He believes that temporary sexual intimacies between boys and girls under 20 from the period of puberty would be far less harmful than separation of the sexes, until marriage with its resultants masturbation, hysteria, repressed and disordered functions, in young women seduction, prostitution, venereal affections, and many other evils. History Roman II. The following narrative was written by a married lady. My mother herself, a very passionate and attractive woman, recognized the difficulty for English girls of getting satisfactorily married and determined, if possible, to shield us from disappointment by turning our thoughts in a different direction. Theoretically, the idea was perhaps good, but in practice it proved useless. The natural desires were there. Disappointment and disillusion followed their repression nonetheless, surely, for having altered their natural shape. I think the love I had for my mother was almost sexual, as to be with her was a keen pleasure, and to be long away from her an almost unendurable pain. She used to talk to us a good deal on all sorts of subjects, but she never troubled about education in the ordinary sense. When 9 years old I had been taught nothing except to read and write. She never forbade us to read anything, but if by accident we got hold of a book of which she did not approve, she used to say, "I think that is rather a silly story, don't you?" We were so eager to come up to her standard of taste that we at once imagined we thought it silly too. In the same way, she discouraged ideas about love or marriage, not by suggesting there was anything wrong or improper about them, but by implying great contempt for girls who thought about lovers, etc. Up to the age of about 20, I had a vague general impression that love was very well for ordinary women, but far beneath the dignity of a somewhat superior person like myself. To show how little it entered my thoughts, I may add that up to 17, I fancied a woman got a child by being kissed on the lips by a man, hence all the fuss in novels about the kiss on the mouth. When I was 9 years old, I began to feel a great craving for scientific knowledge, a child's guide to science which I discovered at a second-hand bookstall, and which, by the way, informed me that heat is due to a substance called caloric, became a constant companion. In order to learn about light and gravitation, I saved up my money and ordered of all books Newton's Principia, shedding bitter tears when I found I could not understand a word of it at the same time. I was horribly ashamed of this desire for knowledge. I got such books as I could surreptitiously, and hid them in odd corners. Why, I cannot imagine, as no one would have objected, but on the contrary, I should have been helped to suitable books. My sisters and I were all violently argumentative, but our quarrels were all on abstract subjects. We saw little of other children, and made no friendships, preferring each other's society to that of outsiders. When I was about 10, a girl of the same age came to stay with us for a few days. When we went to bed the first night, she asked me if I ever played with myself, whereupon I took a great dislike to her. No sexual ideas or feelings were excited. When still quite a child, however, I had feelings of excitement, which I now recognize as sexual. Such feelings always came to me in bed. At least, I cannot remember them at any other time, and were generally accompanied by a gradually increasing desire to make water. For a long time, I would not dare to get out of bed for fear of being scolded for staying awake, and only did so at last when actually compelled. In the meantime, the sexual excitement increased also, and I believe I thought the latter was the result of the former, or perhaps, rather, that both were the same thing. This was when I was about 7 or 8 years old. So far as I can recollect, the excitement did not recur when the desire to make water had been gratified. I seem to remember wondering why, thinking of certain things, I can't remember what these were, should make one want to urinate in later life. I have found that if the bladder is not emptied before coitus, pleasure is often more intense. There were also feelings, which I now recognize as sexual, in connection with ideas of whipping. As a child and girl, I had very strong religious feelings. I should have now if I could believe in the reality of religion, which were absent in my sisters. These feelings were much the same as I experienced later sexually. I felt toward God what I imagined I should like to feel to my husband if I married. This, I fancy, is what usually occurs at 14. I went to a boarding school where there were 70 girls between 7 and 19. I think it goes to show that there is but very little sexual precocity among English girls, that during the 3 years I stayed there, I never heard a word the strictest mother would have objected to. 1 or 2 of the older girls were occasionally a little sentimental, but on no occasion did I hear the physical side of things touched upon. I think this is partly due to the amount of exercise we took. When picturing my childhood, I always see myself racing about, jumping walls, climbing trees in France and Italy. I have been struck by the greater sedateness of continental children. Our idea of naughtiness consisted chiefly in having suppers in our bedrooms and sliding down the banisters. After being sent to bed, the first gratified our natural appetite, while the second supplied the necessary thrill in the fear of being caught. I made no violent friendships with the other girls, but I became much attached to the French governess. She was 30, and a born teacher, very strict with all of us, and doubly so with me for fear of showing favoritism. But she was never unjust, and I was rather proud of her severity, and took a certain pleasure in being punished by her, the punishment always taking the form of learning by heart, which I rather liked doing. So I had my thrill, excitement, I don't quite know what to call it, without any very great inconvenience to myself. Just before we left school, the sexual instinct began to show itself in enthusiasm for art with a capital, Aouda's novels being mainly responsible. My sister and I agreed that we would spend our lives traveling about France, Italy, and the continent, generally a la tricotrin with a violin in one pocket and an Attravante Dante in the other. To do this satisfactorily to ourselves, we must be artists, and I resolved to go in for music and become a second list. When my father offered to take us to Italy, the artist's mecca, for a couple of years, we were wild with delight. We went, and disillusionment began. It may perhaps seem absurd, but we suffered acutely. That first summer our villa was quite on the beach, the lowest of its flight of steps being washed by the Mediterranean. At the back were grounds, which seemed a paradise, long alleys covered over with vines, and carpeted with long grass and poppies, grassy slopes, dotted with olives and ilex roses, everywhere and almost every flower in profusion, with at night the fireflies and the heavy scents of syringa and orange blossoms. In the midst of every possible excitement to the senses, there was one thing wanting, and we did not know what that was. We attributed our restlessness and dissatisfaction to the slow progress in our artistic education, and consoled ourselves by thinking, when once we had mastered the technical difficulties, we should feel all right. And of course, we did derive a very real pleasure from all the beauties of art and nature with which Italy abounds. It seems to me, however, that the art craze is one of the modern phases of woman's sexual life. When we were in Italy, the great centers of the country were simply overrun with girls studying art, most of whom had very little talent, but who had mistaken the restlessness due to the first awakening of the sexual instinct for the divine flame of genius. In our case, it did not matter, as we were not dependent upon our own exertions, but it must have been terribly hard for girls who had burned their boats and chosen art as a career to have added to the repression of their natural desires the bitterness of knowing that in their chosen walk of life, they were failures. The results, as far as work goes, might not be so bad if the passions as in men were occasionally gratified. It is the constant drudgery combined with the disappointment and finding that art alone does not satisfy which is so paralyzing besides sexual gratification, is always followed by exaltation of the mental faculties. Within my experience, no depressing reaction, such as follows pleasure, excited by mental causes, alone. At one time when living at the villa, I met a man about 45 who took rather a fancy to me. I mention this because it woke me up. No emotion was excited. But I realized for the first time, I must have been nearly 20, that I was no longer a child, and that a man could think of me in connection with love. It was only after this, and not immediately after either, that men's society began to have an interest for me, and that I began to think a man's love would be a pleasant thing to possess after all. The sexual instinct, at any rate as regards consciousness, thus developed slowly, and in what I believe to be a very usual sequence: religion, admiration for an older woman, and art. I am not sure that I have made quite enough of the first yet. I do not know that there is any more to say. There were very strong physical feelings connected with all these, which were identical with those now connected with passion, but they were completely satisfied by the mental idea which excited them. The first time I can remember feeling keen physical pleasure was when I was between 7 and 8 years old. I can't recollect the cause, but I remember lying quite still in my little cot, clasping the iron rails at the top. It may be said that this is hardly slow development, but I mean slow as regards one, any connection of the idea with a man, or two, any physical means of excitation. I have laid stress on my desire for knowledge, as I think my sexual feelings were affected by it. A great part of my feeling for my mother was due to the stores of information. She appeared to possess the omniscience of God, was to me his most striking attribute. My French teacher's capacity was her chief attraction. When as a girl I thought of marriage, I desired a man who could explain things to me. One learns later to live one's mental and sexual life separately to a great extent. But at 20, I could not have done so given the opportunity. I should have made the mistake of Dorothea in Middlemarch. I have spoken of the depressing aftereffects of pleasure brought about by a purely mental cause, but I do not think this is the case in childhood and early youth. Perhaps some women feel no such depression afterward, and this may account for their coldness in regard to men. This may perhaps be accounted for by the fact that it occurs much more rarely, and also it is perhaps a natural process before the sexual organs fully develop, and so not harmful. I always find it difficult in expressing the different degrees of physical excitement, even to myself, though I know exactly what I felt as a child from the time of the early experience already mentioned about the age of 7 or 8. And as a young girl, the second stage secretion of mucus was always reached. The amount of secretion has always been excessive, but at first secretion only lasted a short time. Later, it began to last for several hours, or even sometimes the whole night. If the natural gratification has been withheld for a long time, say 3 months, I do not remember ever feeling the third stage complete orgasm until I saw the first man I fancied I cared. For I do not think that mental causes alone have ever produced more than the first 2 stages: general, diffuse excitement, and secretion. I have sometimes wondered whether I could produce the third mechanically, but I have a curious unreasonable repugnance to trying the experiment. It would seem to materialize it too much. As a child and a girl, I was contented to arrive at the second stage, possibly because I did not realize that there was any other, and perhaps this is why I have experienced no evil results. In dreams, the third stage seems to come suddenly, without any leading up to it, either mental or physical, of which I am conscious. I do not, however, remember having any such dreams before I was engaged. They came at a later period. Even then, when great pleasure was experienced, it came as a rule suddenly and sharply, with no dreams leading up to it. The dreams generally take a sad form, an Evangeline and Gabriel business, where one vainly seeks the person who eludes one. I have, however, sometimes had pleasurable dreams of men who were quite indifferent to me, and of whom I never thought when awake. The impression on waking is so strong one could almost fancy one's self really in love with them. I can quite understand falling in love with a person by dreaming of him in this way. The first time I remember experiencing the third stage in waking moments was at a picnic, when the man to whom I have before referred as the first that I fancied I cared for leaned against me accidentally in passing a plate or dish. But I was already in a violent state of excitement at being with him. There was no possibility of anything between us, As he was married, if he guessed my feelings, they were never admitted as I did my best to hide them. I never experienced this, except at the touch of someone I loved. I think the saying about the woman desiring the desire of the man is just about as true as most epigrams. It is the man's personality alone which affects me. His feelings toward me are of, I was going to say, indifference, but at any rate quite secondary importance, and the gratification of my own vanity counts as nothing in such relations. As a rule, to reach even the second stage, the exciting ideas must be associated with some particular person, except in the case of a story, where one identifies oneself with one of the characters in childhood and early youth. It was in the case of religion. The idea of God and the presence and the personality of God, which aroused my feelings, and always seemed very vivid to me in the case of my governess. My feelings were aroused in exactly the same way as later they would be by one's lover in the art craze. I am rather vague as to how it came about, but I think as a rule there was rather a craving for pleasure than pleasure itself. I do not remember ever thinking much about the physical feeling. It seemed as natural that a pleasant emotion should produce pleasant physical effects, as that a painful one should cause tears. As a child, one takes so much for granted, and later on my mind was so much occupied with worrying about the truth of religion that I hardly thought enough about anything else to analyze it carefully. I may summarize my own feelings. Thus, first, exciting ideas alone produce, as a rule, merely the first stage of sexual excitement. Second, the same ideas connected with a particular person will produce the second stage. Third, the same may be said of the presence of the beloved person. Fourth, actual contact appears necessary for the third stage. If the first stage only be reached, the sensation is not pleasurable in reality, or would not be, but for its association, if produced, as I have sometimes found it to be, by a sense of mental incapacity, it is distinctly disagreeable, especially if one feels that the energy which might have been used in coping with the difficulty is being thus dissipated. If it be produced, as it may be as the result of physical or mental restraint, it is also unpleasant, unless the restraint were put upon one by a person one loves. Then, however, the second stage would probably be reached, but this would depend a good deal on one's mood. If the first stage only were reached, I think it would be disagreeable. It would mean a conflict between one's will and sexual feeling. Perhaps women, who feel actual repugnance to the sexual act with a man they love, have never gone beyond the first stage, when their dislike to it would be quite intelligible to me. Some time after the life in Italy had come to an end, I became engaged. There was considerable difficulty in the way of marriage, but we saw a good deal of each other. My fiancé often dined with us, and we met every day. The result of seeing him so frequently was that I was kept in a constant state of strong but suppressed sexual excitement. This was particularly the case when we met in the evening and wandered about the moonlit garden together. When this had gone on about 3 months, I began to experience a sense of discomfort. After each of his visits, the abdomen seemed to swell with a feeling of fullness and congestion, but though these sensations were closely connected with the physical excitement, they were not sufficiently painful to cause me any alarm or make me endeavor to avoid their pleasurable cause. The symptoms got worse, however, and no longer passed off quickly, as at first the swelling increased, considerable pain and a drag-down sensation resulted the moment I tried to walk even a short distance. I was troubled with constant indigestion, weight in the chest, pain in the head and eyes, and continual slight diarrhea. This went on for about 9 months, and then my fiancé was called away from the neighborhood. After his departure, I got a trifle better, but the symptoms remained, though in less acute form. A few months later, the engagement was broken off, and for some weeks I was severely ill with influenza, and was on my back for several weeks when I could get about a little, though very weak. All the swelling was gone, but pain returned. Whenever I tried to walk or stand for long, the indigestion and diarrhea were also very troublesome. I was treated for both by a physician, but without success. Next year, became engaged to my husband, and was shortly after married. The indigestion and diarrhea disappeared soon after. The pain and dragging feeling in the abdomen bothered me much in walking or any kind of exercise. One day, I came across a medical work, The Elements of Social Science, in which I found descriptions of symptoms like those I suffered from. Ascribed to uterine disease, I again applied to a doctor, telling him I thought there was displacement and possibly congestion. He confirmed my opinion and told me to wear a pessary. He ascribed the displacement to the relaxing climate and said he did not think I should ever get quite right again, after the pessary had been placed in position. Every trace of pain etc. left me a year later. I thought I would try and do without the pessary, and to my great satisfaction, none of the old trials came back after its removal, in spite of much trouble, anxiety, sick nursing and fatigue. I attribute the disorder entirely to violent sexual excitement, which was not permitted its natural gratification and relief. I have reason to believe that suppression acts very injuriously on a woman's mental capacity. When excitement is naturally relieved, the mind turns of its own accord to another subject. But when suppressed, it is unable to do this personally. In the latter event, I find the greatest difficulty in concentrating my thoughts, and mental effort becomes painful. Other women have complained to me of the same difficulty. I have tried mechanical mental work, such as solving arithmetical or algebraic problems, but it does no good. In fact, it seems only to increase the excitement. I may remark here that my feelings are always very strong, not only before and after the monthly period, but also during the time itself, very unfortunately, as of course they cannot then be gratified. This only applies to desire from within, as I am strongly susceptible to influences from without at any time. There seems nothing to be done but to bow to the storm, till it passes over. Anything I do, during the time it lasts, even household work, is badly done. The brain seems to become addled for the time being, while, after gratification of desire, it seems to attain an additional quickness and cleverness. Perhaps this cause contributes to the small amount of intellectual and artistic work done by women, admitting their natural inferiority to men in artistic impulse. A woman whose passions are satisfied generally has her strength sapped by maternity, while her attention is drawn from abstract ideas to her children. History Roman 3b states that his first sexual thoughts and acts were curiously connected with whipping. At 12 he and another boy used to beat each other with a cricket bat upon the bare nates and afterward indulge in mutual masturbation. He cannot remember the beginning of his sexual speculation as a child, nor how he learned masturbation. When he was 13, he used to discuss erotic matters with a schoolfellow, who was in the habit of engaging in vulvar intercourse with a girl of his own age. The intercourse was practiced on the way home from school, and in a standing posture. B embraced the girl in the same way. He is not interested in the psychological aspects of the sexual emotion, although his sex passion was early kindled. He never had commerce with prostitutes. He thinks that his youthful experiences had no ill effect upon him morally, mentally, or physically. He practiced masturbation in moderation till he married at the age of 31. History Roman 4I can remember writes the subject trotting away as a youngster about 5 with another boy to see a girl's legs. The idea emanated from the other boy, but I was vaguely interested how or where we were going to see the object in question. I do not remember nor anything further than the intention. When 6 or 7 I remember being put to bed with the nurse girl and feeling her bare arm with undoubted sexual excitement. I remember too gradually feeling along the arm, very cautiously fearing the girl would wake, and being bitterly disappointed to find it was merely the arm. I am almost certain I had then no idea of sex, but the disappointment was actual. These are the only early experiences of the sort I can remember. When about 9, I had others on the coast of the north of England, which had then very few visitors, and seemed to me very remote. I lived in a farmhouse, and used to assist the girls of the farm in looking after young cattle. These girls certainly instilled sexual ideas, though I did not realize them with precision. They used to talk about things, a good many of which I can now see I did not then understand, as they Roman 999. I liked to see these girls waiting with their dresses tucked up. About this time, I fell passionately in love with a girl cousin, but do not remember having any sensual ideas in regard to her. I cannot say that these early experiences had any influence on my later sexual development. So far as I am consciously aware, I have always remembered them vaguely, never with sexual excitement. Sexual dreams took place first at about the age of 13. There was then emission and sensation in sleep. These were, however, not much associated with distinctly sexual dreams. All that I recall after them was the sensation, which, however, I did not even then absolutely localize. Masturbation was undoubtedly the direct result of these dreams. It was tried at first tentatively out of curiosity to determine if the sensation of the dream could be so reproduced. Sexual dreams, such as I have described, occurred frequently, although I cannot say at what interval. I have never experienced the slightest attraction for the same sex. History Roman 5. My maternal grandfather writes the subject of this history was a small farmer who kept a few beagles and greyhounds for hare hunting. He had 3 daughters, one of whom became my mother, one of his sporting companions, a doctor of profligate habits, and a drunkard seduced my mother at the age of 20 when her condition was discovered. She had to flee from the violence of her father, and I was born some distance from her home. After my grandfather's death, I was reared by my grandmother, and saw nothing of my mother until I was nearly 16. She had left the country in shame and disgrace. I believe that in my heredity, the transmission comes chiefly from my mother, who is now 58 years old. Although her life has been blameless in every particular, since her youthful indiscretion she has never got over it, I feel in my character a reflection of her overstrung condition during pregnancy. I can distinctly remember from the age of 9 years, and am sure that I had no sexual feelings before the age of 13, though always in the company of girls. I had many boyish passions for girls always older than myself, but these were never accompanied by sexual desires. I deified all my sweethearts, and was satisfied if I got a flower, a handkerchief, or even a shred of clothing of my inamorata. For the time being, these things gave me a strange, idealistic emotion, but caused no sexual desire or erection. At 13, a 26-year-old sister of a boy companion once sat down on a sheaf of corn, so as to expose the mons veneris, and enticed me to copulate. There was slight erection, and after the act had been continued some time, a pleasurable sensation of ejaculation, but without true emission. I had frequent relations with this woman after that. About this time, the farm servant of a neighbor taught me masturbation. The mistress of the farm, a thin, willowy, dark woman, the mother of several children, treated me with such familiarity as once to urinate in my presence, so that I saw her very hirsute mons veneris. From that moment, I conceived a great passion for her, and used to tremble as soon as I saw her. I had become well developed and virile, but though I think she was a lustful woman, I never ventured to touch her. I found an extreme ecstasy in masturbating while gazing upon some article of her clothing. This gave me much greater sexual pleasure than actual connection with the ever-willing sister of my schoolfellow. I think I loved the married woman best, because the mons veneris was more covered with hair. This has always had a peculiar attraction for me. Later, when accosted by prostitutes, I never would go with them, unless I was assured the mons veneris was very hirsute. Never much addicted to masturbation, I derived no great enjoyment therefrom, unless I had hair or part of the clothing of the woman with whom I was indulging in psychic coitus. At 16, I left school and went to a large city to learn a business. At this time, the sexual appetite was very strong. I frequently had intercourse with 3 women in one evening. I have had but few lascivious dreams. In these, the phantom partner was almost invariably a dead woman. When about 8, I had seen the dead body of an aunt who died at 24. When 20, I went to London and took all the pleasure which came my way. I cared only for normal coitus. Offers of another type created disgust. I once allowed a woman to exhaust me sexually orally, but felt degraded thereby. Women with whom I had become very intimate often urged me to cunnilingus, but I could not do it. I have practiced intermammary coitus a very few times. At 26, I married a pure, gentle woman. After having for 10 months before marriage led a life of celibacy, my wife died when I was 30, and for about 8 months I lived a celibate life. Lascivious dreams sometimes occurred, but I invariably awoke before ejaculation. Eventually, I gave way to the cravings of my strong sexual nature, but never wished for anything out of the usual, except intercourse from behind. A woman with marked development of the nates has great attraction for me. Solitary masturbation has for some time ceased, but a nude woman in the act of masturbation with her back to me gives me great pleasure. I am as strong sexually at 38 as I was at 20 only. I never want women unless I am brought into actual contact with them, and they are hairy and have large pelvic development. I am in excellent health. Genitals are well developed, and I am clothed with hair from the chin to the genitals. My skull is dolichocephalic. I am violent and tenacious in temper, high-strung, and rapid in thought and action. My digestion is good, but I have a tendency to constipation. Occasionally, I have a twinge of pain below the occipital region. My early views of women have changed. I no longer deify them, though I study them. I have known very sensual women living at home in respectable middle-class society. One in particular, a girl of 18, after coitus used to excite me lingually. I have had a sweetheart who remained Virgo intacta. Had I seduced her, as I could have done, I should have lost all interest in her. I could never bear the presence of naked men, and would never go to a public swimming bath for that reason. I regard myself as a man of abnormally strong, but on the whole healthy and wholesome sexual feelings. As a rule, I have coitus twice or oftener in 1 week, and I practice withdrawal. I am a total abstainer, and never could embrace a woman who smelled of drink. History Romans 6, the writer of the following, is a man of letters married quite early. I remember a strange and romantic interest in the feminine certainly. Before I was 9, I had a strong affection for a little girl playmate. Our family lost sight of hers, and I saw and heard nothing of her for 16 years. Then hearing she was coming to town, I experienced quite a flutter of heart. So strong had been the impression caused at even the early age of our acquaintance. Not that I mean to say I never wavered in between through the whole of my boyhood. I remember persistent romantic interests in girls and women, whose smooth, fair faces and sweet voices exercised ever a subtle attraction over me. Before I was 12, I had picked out my future wife a dozen times, at least a different one each time. Of course, curiosity as to the physical detail of sex and birth was singularly absent. Possibly, this was partly due to the fact that the only younger member of our family was born when I was but 4 years old. Grave shy and reserved, I was never taken into the counsels of prurient schoolmates. I was unaware that there was such discussion between them, though it is, I suppose, not probable that our school was exempt. I was a great reader, and when about 12 or 13, I came across a reference to an illegitimate child which puzzled me ere long. However, in my random and extensive reading, I hit on a book that touched on phallicism, and I learned that there were male and female organs of generation. I had neither shame nor curiosity. I jumped to the conclusion that during close caresses, somehow a subtle aroma arose from the man to fertilize the woman. I left the subject at this satisfied, and had no inkling of the real intimacy of the embrace. About 14, much interested in Bradleff, I bought both the Knowlton pamphlet and Mrs. Besant's population book. I found the physical details in scientific language so dull that I could not peruse them. By reading the argumentative passages, I learned that somehow I knew not how children could be produced or not produced as desired, and in this stage of the matter, it seemed to me so admirable that it should be so that I wondered why there should be cavil. About this age, my elder brother believed it to be his duty to tell me the secrets of sex. I remember his talking to me, while I bored and uninterested thought of something else. When he finished, I had heard nothing. Remember, I felt no shame on the matter, none at all. I was simply bored. This I attribute to 2 things. First, my preponderating interest in the romantic side of things. Secondly, and this bears with it a strong moral, the feeling that the knowledge lay always within my grasp kept me from that curiosity which so oft consumes those who think it is hidden away from them. The changes of puberty came naturally, and without startling me. Even the fact of emission switch took place during sleep at intervals unaccompanied by dreams, or by any physical prostration afterward, has left on my memory no recollection of surprise. I knew it to be somehow connected with generation, but I had no physical trouble, and I am quite sure I did not bother further about it. The best possible proof of this lies in the fact that my memory is a blank on the matter at the age of 21. I take this from a diary, so I know it is correct. I was still ignorant as to intrinsic fact. Then I pulled myself together, and felt it was really time I learned the actual details of the matter. I went to a clever friend of mine, and asked him to tell me all about it. He expressed himself astounded at my not knowing, and he had very great shyness about telling me. In fact, I had to drag facts out of him by a real cross-examination, during which he persistently marveled at my ignorance, though he had a great deal of false shame about the matter. I had none at all. His revelations considerably surprised me, because I had no idea that there was actual intermission. When I came to reflect on what I had learned, the fact of this close physical intimacy appealed to me as being quite poetic and beautiful between 2 lovers, and I have had no reason since to change my opinion. Summary 1. Romantic interest in girls and women, commencing early and remaining persistently. 2. Knowledge before puberty of the fact that this interest was based on the all-important process of reproduction. 3. Absence of further physical curiosity, even at puberty itself. 4. Knowledge ultimately acquired without shock. The physical in sex has never been any bother to me, neither have I bothered about it. I have recognized it frankly, and don't see why I shouldn't. But my unashamed recognition has probably been because the merely physical is less absorbing to me than to most mental and emotional interest in passion has absorbed me greatly, but the merely physical has sunk into what I call its natural place of subordination. Nature is kind. It is our conspiracy of silence, which tends to emphasize physical detail. History Roman 7 Roman 500, who is a doctor and a man of science, writes, "There is a strong history of gout on the paternal side, no history of alcohol, tubercle, brain trouble, or of the arthropathies. There is some reason to believe that two of my maternal aunts were sexually frigid. And perhaps this was true to a less extent of my mother, who had a contracted pelvis, necessitating the induction of labor at the 8th month of pregnancy. About the age of 7, a German nursery governess B took charge of me, and I soon became devoted to her. I was then a delicate child, and used to suffer frequently from nightmare, waking up screaming and covered with sweat. When this happened, B would sometimes take me into her bed and soothe me with kisses, etc. These I returned, and can remember that I was particularly fond of kissing her breasts. About this time, a girl cousin A, about a year older than myself, was one of my most frequent playmates. I endeavored to monopolize her company and attention, and on this account, often came to blows with Roman 100, a cousin, rather younger than myself, who has since told me that he was then in love with A and jealous of me. I believe I was really jealous and in love at the time, but cannot remember that anything in the nature of caresses took place between A and myself. Some time later, probably when I was about 9, something led up to B saying that she was not built like I was, that she had no penis, etc. I cannot remember my nursery term for penis. I was incredulous, and demanded to be allowed to see if it was true. This was refused, and I made many plans to gratify my curiosity, such as slipping into her room, when she was dressing, tipping up the chair she was sitting in, and trying to suddenly thrust my hand up under her skirts. I did not succeed in finding out, but have since thought that although she did not allow me to attain the object of my efforts, the later game caused her pleasurable sensations. I regard these efforts as being prompted purely by curiosity. I had no feelings of warmth or irritations of the genitals, and I certainly never manipulated them, nor was I, as far as I can judge, an unusually prurient small boy. B left when I was about 10, when I went to a preparatory school. At 12, I was sent to a public school, and was then told by my father the chief facts of sex, and warned to avoid masturbation. My first wet dream took place when I was 14. Rather before this, I had begun to suffer with severe intermittent testicular neuralgia, which practically defied all treatment, and continued on and off for 4 or 5 years, the attacks gradually becoming fewer and less. When 15, circumstances compelled me to leave school, and to live for 2 years at the seaside with no companions of my own age. I had, however, the run of a well-stocked library, and fished and collected insects energetically. At 16, I made love to the trained nurse attending my mother, but owing more, I think, to my timidity than to the austerity of her virtue, got no further than kissing. About this time, wet dreams became inconveniently frequent. They would occur 3 or 4 times weekly, and resisted the stock remedies. At 17, I was advised to try connection. This I did, and found but little pleasure in the act, there being a strong aesthetic objection to the love that keeps awake for lure. About this time, I found in the United States pharmacopoeia a remedy for my emissions, which have, however, always remained rather more frequent than those of the average individual. Judging from the experience of my friends, emissions are generally accompanied by lascivious dreams, but at times take place when I dream that I am hurrying to catch a train or to micturate against time. I have of late years not noticed, till after 20, observed that the dream accompanying emission is shorter, so that whereas up to, say, 21, I generally performed the whole physiological act with my dream charmer, I now almost invariably emit and awake before intermission has taken place. There has been no alternation comparable to this in the performance of the act while I am awake. As regards my physique, I should mention that all my reflexes are very brisk, though I am only slightly ticklish in the ordinary sense of the term. I sweat easily, and am very shy not only with women, but with any strangers. I have, however, trained myself not to show this. About averagely passionate, I should say, and extremely critical where women are concerned, the latter quality often keeping me chaste for months at a time. History Roman 8, when I was about 8 years old, states the lady, who is the subject of the present observation, I remember that with several other children, we used to play in an old garden at being father and mother, unfastening our drawers, and bringing the sexual parts together, as we imagined married people to do. But no sexual feelings were aroused, nor did the boys have erections. When about 10 years old, she became conscious of a pleasurable sensation associated with the smell of leather, which has ever since persisted at that age. She was sometimes left to wait in the office of a wholesale business house full of leather-bound ledgers. She did not then notice the sensation particularly, and was certainly not conscious of any connection with sexual emotion. Menstruation was established at 13-12 years. Distinct sexual feelings were first observed a few months later. The first feelings of love which I ever felt were at the age of 14, for a nice manly boy of my own age who often came to our house. He liked me, but was not in love with me. It was very seldom that he would sit by me and hold my hand as I wished him. This went on till I was about 17, when he went to the university. After his first term he came back, and was then attracted to me, but though I loved him very much I was too proud to show it. When he tried to kiss me, I resisted, though I longed for it, thinking I was greatly offended. He apologized, which only made me angry. All these years I was worshipping at his shrine, and mixed him up with all my ideas of life. Whenever she was near him, she experienced physical sensations with moistening of the vulva. This continued till she was about 20, but the object of these emotions never again attempted any advances. At 19, she became engaged to someone else. At the beginning, she was physically indifferent to her lover, but when he first kissed her, she became greatly excited. The engagement, however, was soon broken off from absence of strong affection on either side, and chiefly, it would seem, from the cooling of the lover's ardor. She thinks he would have been more strongly attached to her if she had been colder to him, or pretended to be, instead of responding with simplicity and frankness. During the next few years little occurred. She was working hard, and her amusements would mostly, she says, be regarded as rather childish. She was extremely fond of dancing, and she was always pleased when anyone paid her attention. She was frequently conscious of sexual feelings, sometimes tormented by them, and she regarded this as something to be ashamed of. The constant longing for love was affected little or not at all by hard work. At about this time, I was very fond of abandoning myself to daydreams. I was very glad if I could get everyone out of the house and lie on an easy chair or the bed. I liked especially to read poetry, all the more if I did not quite understand it. This would lead me on to all sorts of dreams of love, which however never went beyond the preliminaries of actual lovers. That was all I then knew of love. The only climax to her dream of love was founded on a piece of information volunteered by a married woman many years earlier, when she was about 12. This lady evidently agreeing with Rousseau, who in Emile commended the mother's reply to the child's query, "Whence babies come les femmes, les passent mon, enfant avec des grands douleurs," that the unknown should first be explained to the young in terms of the known. Told her that the husband mixturated into the wife. She therefore used to imagine a lover who would bear her away into a forest, and do this on her, as she lay at the foot of a tree. At a later date, she accidentally discovered that a full bladder tended to enhance sexual feelings, and occasionally resorted to this physical measure of heightening excitement. All the physical sensations of sexual desire were called out by these daydreams with abundant secretion, but never the orgasm. Her reveries never led to masturbation, or to allied manifestations which have never taken place. Such a method of relief has indeed never offered any temptation to her, and she doubts even its possibility in her case. At a later period of life, however, at the age of 31, masturbation began, and was practiced at intervals at the same time. She remarks that while no orgasm, of which indeed she was then ignorant, ever occurred, the sexual excitement produced by the daydreams was sufficiently great to cause a feeling of relief afterward. These daydreams were the only way in which the sexual erethism was discharged. She cannot recall having erotic dreams or any sexual manifestations during sleep. Spontaneous sexual excitement was present a few days before menstruation, and fairly marked during and immediately after the period. It also tended to recur in the middle of the intermenstrual period. The pleasurable sensation connected with the smell of leather became more marked. As she approached adult age, it was especially pronounced about the age of 24, and the sexual emotion it produced with moisture of the vulva was then clearly conscious. No other odor produced this effect in such a marked degree. It was often associated with leather bags, but not with boots, though on rubbing the leather of shoes she found that this odor was given out. She cannot account for its origin, and does not connect any association with it. It never affected her conduct, or led to fetichistic habits. Some other odors affect her in the same way, though not to the same degree as leather. This is more especially the case with some flowers, especially white flowers, with heavy odors, like gardenias. Many flowers, on the other hand, like primroses, seem rather opposed to sex effect too fresh. Though stimulating to the mind, some artificial scents tend to produce sexual effects. Also, personal odors have no influence of this kind at a later period. The sexual influence of personal odors was occasionally experienced, but the present history deals only with the period before marriage. She believes that most beautiful things, however unconnected with sex, have a tendency to produce distinctively sexual feelings in a faint degree. Although sometimes more marked with secretion, she has however never experienced homosexual feeling, and on first consideration, was inclined to believe that the sight of a beautiful woman had no sexual effect on her, though she could quite understand such an effect. Subsequently, on recalling as well as observing her experiences more carefully, she found that a lovely woman's face and figure, especially on one occasion, the very graceful figure of a beautiful fairy, in a ballet, produced distinct sexual sensations. With mucus emission, music, however, has strongly emotional effects upon her, and she cannot recall that she ever felt any equally powerful influence of this kind in the absence of music. Looking back on the development of her feelings, she finds that though in some respects they may have been slow, they were simple, natural, spontaneous, and correspond to the dawning and progress which go on in the development of every girl. While it is going on in actual fact, the girl does not know or bother herself about trying to understand it afterward. It seems quite clear and simple. Full occupation of the brain and hands too, while it does not do away with desire, is a great help and safeguard to a growing girl, when combined with proper information about herself and her relation to man the animal, so that she may realize where she is and how to choose the right man. Though under the best conditions failure may occur. History Roman 9. The subject belongs to a large family having some neurotic members. She spent her early life on a large farm. She is vigorous and energetic, has intellectual tastes, and is accustomed to think for herself from unconventional standpoints. On many subjects her parents were very religious, and not she. Thinks of sensual temperament. Her own early life was free from associations of a sexual character, and she can recall little that now seems to be significant in this respect. She remembers that in childhood, and for some time later, she believed that children were born through the navel. Her activities went chiefly into humanitarian and utopian directions, and she cherished ideas of a large, healthy, free life, untrammeled by civilization. She regards herself as very passionate, but her sexual emotions appear to have developed very slowly and have been somewhat intellectualized after reaching adult life. She has formed several successive relationships with men to whom she has been attracted by affinity in temperament, in intellectual views, and in tastes. These relationships have usually been followed by some degree of disillusion, and so have been dissolved. She does not believe in legal marriage, though under fitting circumstances, she would much like to have a child. She never masturbated until the age of 27. At that time, a married friend told her that such a thing could be done. She found it gave her decided pleasure, indeed more than coitus had ever given her. Except with one man, she has never practiced it to excess, only at rare intervals, and is of the opinion that it is decidedly beneficial when thus moderately indulged in. She has sometimes found, for instance, that after the mental excitement produced by delivering a lecture, sleep would be impossible if masturbation were not resorted to as a sedative to relieve the tension. Spontaneous sexual excitement is strongest just before the monthly period. Definite sexual dreams and sexual excitement during sleep have not occurred, except possibly on one or two occasions. She has from girlhood experienced erotic daydreams, imagining love stories of which she herself was the heroine. The climax of these stories has developed with her own developing knowledge of sexual matters. She is not inverted, and has never been in love with a woman. She finds, however, that a beautiful woman is distinctly a sexual excitation, calling out definite physical manifestations of sexual emotion. She explains this by saying that she thinks she instinctively puts herself in the place of a man, and feels as it seems to her a man would feel. She finds that music excites the sexual emotions, as well as many scents, whether of flowers, the personal odor of the beloved person, or artificial perfumes. History Roman 10. The subject is of German extraction on both sides. The father is of marked intellectual tastes, as also is she herself. There is no unhealthy strain in the family, so far as she is aware, though they all have very strong passions. She is well developed, healthy, vigorous, and athletic. Any trouble, to which she is subject being mainly due to overwork. Looking back on her childhood, she can now see various sexual manifestations occurring at a period when she was quite ignorant of sex matters. The very first she writes was at the age of 6. I remember once sitting astride a banister while my parents were waiting for me outside. I distinctly remember a pleasurable sensation, probably in part due to a physical feeling in the thought of staying there when I knew I ought to have run out to them from that year. Till the age of 10, I simply reveled in the idea of being tortured. I went gladly to bed every night to imagine myself a slave, chained, beaten, made to carry loads and do ignominious work. One of my imaginings, I remember, was that I was chained to a moldering skeleton. As she grew older, these fancies were discontinued. At the same time, there was a trace of sadistic tendency. I used to frighten and tease a young child driven to it by an irresistible impulse, and experiencing a certain pleasurable feeling in so doing. But this, I am glad to say, was rare, as I hate all cruelty. One of her favorite imaginings as a child was that she was a boy, and especially that she was a knight rescuing damsels in distress. She was not fond of girls' occupations, and has always had a sort of chivalrous feeling toward women. When I first heard of the sexual act, she writes, it appeared to me so absurd that I took little notice. About the age of 10, I discussed it a good deal with other girls, and we used to play childishly indecent games out of pure mischief, and not from any definite physical feeling. About a year after menstruation was established, she accidentally discovered the act of masturbation. By leaning over a table, I discovered it naturally. No one taught me, and the very naturalness of the impulse that led me to it often made me in later years question the harmfulness. Both her sisters masturbated from a very early age, but not to her knowledge. Her brother, the practice of masturbation was continued for many years. Imbued with the old ideas of morality, I struggled against it. In vain. The sight of animals copulating, the perusal of various books, Shakespeare, Rabelais, Godard's Mademoiselle de Maupin, etc., the sight of the nude, in some bacchanalian pictures, such as Rubens, all aroused passion. Coexistent with this, perhaps, though I doubt it, due to it arose a disgust for normal intercourse. I fell in love, and enjoyed kisses, etc., but the mere thought of anything beyond disgusted me. Had my lover suggested such a thing, I would have lost all love for him. But all this time I went on masturbating, though as seldom as possible, and without thought of my lover. Love was to me a thing ideal and quite apart from lust, and I still think that it is false to try to connect the two. I fear that even now, if I fell in love, sexual intercourse would break the charm. At the age of 18, I came across Tolstoy's Kreutzer Sonata, and was overjoyed to find all I had thought written down there. Gradually, through seeing a friend happily married, I have grown to a more normal view of things. I am very critical of men, and have never met one liberal-minded, and just enough to please me. Perhaps, if I did, I might take a perfectly healthy view of things. In course of time, various devices had been adopted to heighten sexual excitement when indulging in masturbation. Thus, for instance, she found that the effects of sexual excitement are increased by keeping the bladder full, but the chief method which she had devised for heightening and prolonging the preliminary excitement consisted in wearing tight stays. As a rule, she wears loose stays, and in painting her face, she cannot herself explain this. Self-excitement is completed by friction, or sometimes by the introduction of a piece of wood into the vagina. She finds that the more frequently she masturbates, the more easily she is excited. Spontaneous sexual feeling is strongest before and after the menstrual period, not so much so during the periods. There are various faint traces of homosexuality, it may be gathered, in the history of this subject's sexual development. Recently, these have come to a climax in the formation of a homosexual relationship with a girlfriend. This relationship has given her great pleasure and satisfaction. She does not, however, regard herself as being a really inverted person. There have been vivid sexual dreams, from about 17 apparently, about the period of the relationship with the lover. These dreams have not, however, had special reference to persons of either sex. Apart from the influence of books and pictures, already mentioned, she remarks that she is sexually affected by the personal odor of a beloved person, but is not consciously affected by any other odors. History. Roman 11 widower, aged 40 years, surgeon. My experience of sexual matters began early. When I was about 10 years of age, a boy friend, who was staying with us, told me that his sister made him uncover his person with which she played, and encouraged him to do the same for her. He said it was great fun, and suggested that we should take 2 of my sisters into an old barn, and repeat his experience on them. This we did, and tried all we could to have connection with them. They were nothing loath, and did all they could to help us, but nothing was affected, and I experienced no pleasure in it. When I went back to school, I attracted the attention of one of the big boys who slept in the same room with me. He came into my bed and began to play with my member, saying that it was the usual thing to do and would give me pleasure. I did not feel any pleasure, but I liked the attention and rather enjoyed playing with his member, which was of large size and surrounded by thick pubic hair. After I had played with him for some time, I was surprised at his having an emission of sticky matter afterward. He rubbed me again, saying that if I let him do it long enough he would produce the same substance from me. This he failed to do, however, though he rubbed me long and frequently on that and many other occasions. I was very disappointed at not being able to have an emission, and on every occasion that offered I endeavored to excite myself to the extent of compassing this. I used to ask to go out of school 2 or 3 times a day, and retired to the closet where I practiced on myself most diligently, but to no purpose at that time, though I began to have pleasurable emotions in the act. When I went home for the holidays, I took a great interest in one of my father's maids, whose legs I felt as she ran upstairs one day. I was in great fear that she would complain of what I had done, but I was delighted to find that she did nothing of the sort. On the contrary, she took to kissing and fondling me, calling me her sweetheart, and saying that I was a forward boy. This encouraged me greatly, and I was not long in getting to more intimate relations with her. She called me into her room one day when we were alone in the house, she being in a half-dressed condition, and put me on the bed, and laid herself on me, kissing me passionately on the mouth. She next unbuttoned my trousers, and fondled and kissed my member, and directed my hand to her privates. I became very much excited and trembled violently, but was able to do for her what she wanted in the way of masturbation, until she became wet. After this, we had many meetings in which we embraced, and she let me introduce my member until she had satisfied herself, though I was too young to have an emission. On return to school, I practiced mutual masturbation with several of my schoolfellows, and finally at the age of 14 years, had my first real emission. I was greatly pleased thereat, and with this, and the growth of hair which began to show on my pubis, began to feel myself quite a man. I loved lying in the arms of another boy, pressing against his body, and fondling his person, and being fondled by him in return. We always finished up with mutual masturbation. We never indulged in any unnatural connections. After leaving school, I had no opportunity of indulging in relations with my own sex, and indeed, did not wish for such, as I became a slave to the charms of the other sex, and passed most of my time in either enjoying or planning to enjoy love passages with them. The sight of a woman's limbs or bust, especially if partly hidden by pretty underclothing, and the more so if seen by stealth, was sufficient to give a lustful feeling, and a violent erection, accompanied by palpitation of the heart and throbbing in the head. I had frequent coitus at the age of 17, as well as masturbating regularly. I liked to perform masturbation on a girl even more than I liked having connection with her. And this was especially so in the case of girls who had never had masturbation practiced on them before. I loved to see the look of surprised pleasure appear on their faces as they felt the delightful and novel sensation. To gratify this desire, I persuaded dozens of girls to allow me to take liberties with them, and it would surprise you to learn what a number of girls, many of them in good social position, permitted me the liberty I desired, though the supply was never equal to my demand. With a view to enlarging my opportunities, I took up the study of medicine as a profession, and reveled in the chances it gave of being on intimate sexual terms with many who would have been otherwise out of my reach. At the age of 25, I married the daughter of an officer, a beautiful girl with a fully developed figure and an amorous disposition. While engaged, we used to pass hours wrapped in each other's arms practicing mutual masturbation, or I would kiss her passionately on the mouth, introducing my tongue into her mouth at intervals, with the invariable result that I had an emission, and she went off into sighs and shivers. After marriage, we practiced all sorts of fancy coitus reservatus, etc., and rarely passed 24 hours without 2 conjunctions, until she got far on in the family way, and our play had to cease for a while. During this interval, I went to stay at the house of an old schoolfellow who had been one of my lovers of days gone by. It happened that on account of the number of guests staying in the house, the bed accommodation was somewhat scanty, and I agreed to share my friend's bedroom. The sight of his naked body as he undressed gave rise to lustful feelings in me, and when he had turned out the light, I stole across to his bed and got in beside him. He made no objection, and we passed the night in mutual masturbation and embraces, coitus inter femora, etc. I was surprised to find how much I preferred this state of affairs to coitus with my wife, and determined to enjoy the occasion to the full. We passed a fortnight together in the above fashion, and though I afterward went back and did my duty by my wife, I never took the same pleasure in her again, and when she died 5 years later, I felt no inclination to contract another marriage, but devoted myself heart and soul to my old school friend, with whom I continued tender relations, until his death by accident last year. Since then I have lost all interest in life. The patient, writes the well-known alienist to whom I am indebted for the above history, consulted me lately. I found him a fairly healthy man to look at, suffering from some neurasthenia, and a tendency to melancholia. Generative organs, large, one testicle shows, some wasting pubic hair, abundant form of body, distinctly masculine temperament, neurotic. He improved under treatment, and after seeing me 3 times, and writing out the above history, came no history. Roman 12, Mrs. B, aged 32, father's family normal, mother's family clever, eccentric, somewhat neuropathic. She is herself normal, good-looking, usually healthy, highly intelligent, and with much practical ability, though at some periods of life, and especially in childhood, she has shared to some extent in the high-strung and supersensitive temperament of her mother's family. As a child, she was sometimes spoiled, and sometimes cuffed, and suffered tortures from nervousness. She has, however, acquired a large measure of self-control. The first sensations, which she now recognizes as sexual, were experienced at the age of 3, when her mother gave her an injection. Afterward, she declared herself unable to relieve her bowels. Naturally, in order to obtain a repetition of this experience, which was several times repeated at the age of 7, a man pursued her with attentions and attempted to take liberties, but she rejected his advances in terror. 4 years later, another man attempted to assault her, but she resisted vigorously, struck him, and escaped by running. Neither of these sexual attempts appears to have left any serious permanent impression on the child's mind. At the age of 11, when her mother was giving her a bath, the sensation of her mother's fingers touching her private parts gave her what she now knows to be sexual feelings. And a year later, when taking her bath, she would pour hot water on to the sexual region in order to cause these sensations. This did not lead to masturbation, but she had a vague idea that it was wrong. At the age of 12, menstruation began. She suffered very severely from dysmenorrhea, the period sometimes lasting for 10 days. And the pain being often extreme, she was not treated for this condition, her mother being of opinion that she would outgrow it from the age of 14 or 15, until 23 or about the period of her marriage. She suffered from anemia. She had little curiosity about sexual matters. Her mother wished that she should always come to her for information about things she became acquainted with as to the general facts of sex. She did not, however, know definitely the facts of copulation. Until her marriage, she knew nothing of erection or semen, and thought that when a man and woman placed their organs together, a child resulted. She hated talking about these subjects indecently, and would not listen to the sexual conversation of her schoolfellows. She never felt any homosexual attraction. Once another girl was much in love with her, but she despised and disliked her attentions again when a girl much older than herself, a friend of her mother's, slept with her and made advances. She repelled her and refused to sleep with her again. She always got on well with men, and men were attracted to her. She was direct and sincere without undue modesty, but she never allowed men to touch her or kiss her. She was a good dancer and fond of dancing, but denies that it ever led to sexual feelings. She never felt any sexual attraction for a man, until at the age of 20, she fell in love with her future husband 5 years or more before marriage. At this period, she began to feel vague discomfort which she knew to be localized near her sexual organs. She was aware in a dim way that it was connected with her love, and was of a sexual nature, but there was no definite idea of sexual intercourse. She felt nervous and depressed. If she had been asked to state what would relieve her, she could only have said B.S. presence and tenderness. A few days before he declared his love, she experienced the nearest approach to sexual feeling she had ever had. It was summer, and with B and some of her family, she had gone on a little expedition one evening in the train. After a day's excursion, B took her hand unperceived by the others, and held it for some time. This aroused the strongest emotions in her. She closed her eyes, and though she was not at the time aware that her sensations were localized in her sexual organs, she thinks in the light of subsequent knowledge that she then experienced the orgasm. During the engagement, which lasted between 2 and 3 years, circumstances prevented frequent meetings. B would kiss her, suck her nipples, which became erect, and lie on her. She allowed him to take these liberties, feeling that if she refused him all satisfaction, he might have relations with other women. She still felt no definite desire for contact of the sexual organs. She longed rather to be embraced and kissed, and to lie in her lover's arms all night. A few months before marriage, however, she masturbated occasionally just before or just after menstruation, imagining, while doing it, that she was in her lover's arms. The act was usually followed by a sick feeling. Just before marriage, she underwent an operation for the relief of the dysmenorrhea. She was somewhat shocked and sickened by the experiences of the wedding night. It seemed to her that her husband approached her with the violence of an animal, and there was some difficulty in effecting entrance. Coitus, though incomplete, took place some 7 times on this first night. The bleeding from rupture of the hymen continued, so that for 2 days she had to wear a towel for 2 months. Subsequently, there was great pain during intercourse, although she suppressed the indications of this. There were several children born of the marriage, and for some years she lived happily on the whole with her husband, notwithstanding various hardships and difficulties, and some incompatibility of temper. As regards her sexual feelings, she considers, from what other women have told her, that her feelings are if anything stronger than the average. The orgasm, however, was not fully developed until about 5 years after marriage. Sexual feeling is most pronounced before, during, and after the menstrual period, more especially before and about the 3rd day. The period usually lasts from 5 to 7 days. There is more sexual desire during pregnancy, especially toward the end, than at any other time. She never refused normal intercourse to her husband, but any abnormal or perverted method of sexual gratification is repellent. She was awakened one night about the 3rd month of pregnancy by her husband inserting his penis in, or the child was born with palate defect, and she is herself inclined to believe that this incident was the cause of the defect. Though she desires normal intercourse, she has seldom obtained complete gratification for a long time. She disliked seeing or touching the penis, and the feel, and especially the smell of the semen, produced nausea and even vomiting. She has a very delicate sense of smell, as well as of taste. Though fond of the scent of flowers, no sexual feelings are thus aroused. Withdrawal and the use of condoms are unsatisfactory to her, and mutual masturbation gives no relief and produces headache. Feelings of friendship for her husband have been most potent in arousing the sexual emotions, and she has had most pleasure in intercourse after a day spent in bicycling together. She has been for many months at a time without sexual intercourse, and during such periods has suffered much from pain in the head. This, however, she has now completely surmounted. She eventually discovered that her husband's abstinence from marital intercourse was due to infidelity. This led to a definite separation. She still occasionally experiences sexual desire, but has no inclination to masturbate. Her life is full and busy, affording ample scope for her energies and intelligence. Moreover, she has her children to train and educate. She herself believes that her sexual life is at an end. History. Roman 13 Gr. Army officer. I am 35 years of age. My parents married at the ages of 38 and 25, and my father is now 84, and my mother 71. Both are particularly strong and healthy in body and mind. I am of old lineage on both sides, and know of no disease, defect, or abnormality among any of my ancestors or relations, except that my mother's family has a slight tendency to drink and excess, the present members of it all being considered eccentric. I have 1 brother and 1 sister living, brother unmarried, sister with several children, and am the youngest of a family of 5. My brother is abnormal, but I don't know exactly in what way, or from what cause. I have a strong suspicion that he masturbates to excess. My father is artistic, and my mother musical. I have no aptitude for either, but appreciate both enormously. Though not until about 10 years ago, my principal reading is religion, science, and philosophy, with an occasional standard novel, or a modern novel of the improper type, by way of relaxation. I became a convinced and militant rationalist about 5 years ago, but have been an unbeliever since I left school. I was anemic and threatened with bowel complaint at the age of 7, and was in consequence taken abroad for my health. I am now strong and vigorous with great powers of endurance, and enjoy all forms of sport, and exercise, particularly hunting, pigsticking, and polo. I drink a lot, and am never fitter than when eating, drinking, and taking exercise in what most people would call excess. It takes more alcohol than I can hold to make me drunk when in England, but not so in the East. I have been told that I am very good-looking. When I was about 4 or 5, I was constantly chaffed by my older companions about putting my hand down my trousers and playing with my privates. I don't remember getting an erection nor at what age. This first occurred with me at one time my brother, and I used to play about with my sister's underclothing and took great pleasure in it. But we never saw her genitals. She told us that on carefully examining herself one day, she was glad to find that she had a small penis like boys had, doubtless the clitoris. When in France at the age of 8 to 10, I began to notice the sexual parts of animals, and was very keen to know what mares kept between their hind legs. Later on, I took great pleasure with another boy in feeling the teats of a sheese, and by myself the penis of a donkey, as I had seen the French grooms do. But I took no interest in my own penis. I used to put my finger as far up the anus as it would go and got a vague satisfaction from it. I went to a small private school at the age of 11, having been previously told by my mother of the manner of birth of men and animals, of which I was quite ignorant. Till then she made no mention of the part taken by the father, and I never thought about it. Even then, I was left with the impression that one was born through the navel. I was initiated at school, and used to handle the penis of the boy, who told me on several occasions I did fellatio for him and liked it, but he never offered to do the same for me, and I don't think he got much satisfaction out of it. Soon after this, I became conscious of pleasurable sensations when lying on my stomach with an erection, and used occasionally to gratify myself that way, caring little for the school tradition that it was wicked and bad for one. On one occasion, when talking at night with another boy, we compared our organs both in erection, and I then for the first time thought of trying what I had heard vaguely mentioned, viz. 2 boys playing at man and woman. I lay on him with my penis on his stomach and almost at once had an orgasm with emission and experienced acute pleasure, though both he and I supposed that I had involuntarily micturated. I was 13. When this happened, I did it once more with him, before I left, this time the other way up so as to spare him the unpleasantness. I used to like kissing and hugging the smaller boys, and had a great eye for good looks. On going home for the holidays, I masturbated with my hand out of curiosity to see what happened when the orgasm occurred, and then only did I fully understand nature of the act. After this, the rush and strangeness of a large public school distracted my attention, but I heard about wet dreams, masturbation, and homosexuality from the other boys, and soon became thoroughly initiated. I believe the tone of my house, if not of the whole school, was exceptionally bad, though it may only be that I saw more of it because I was attracted by it, and that other schools are the same. Really, things involving certain expulsion, if found out, were done more or less in public, and I have myself openly got into bed with or masturbated other boys, and on more than one occasion have helped forcibly to masturbate small boys, or to hold them, while others had connection with them, the idea of the last 2 acts being that the boy would thereby be seduced and become available for and willing to perform homosexuality. Before I became big enough to have boys myself, I masturbated frequently, on one occasion 3 times in the day, and invariably by lying on my stomach, without the use of the hands. In having connection with other boys, I used to do it between the thighs or on the stomach, and I never heard of any other way at that school. Pedicatio would disgust me, and moreover would deprive me of the principal pleasure of intercourse, viz. The feeling of lying face to face and stomach to stomach. Of course the satisfaction used to be mutual, but though good-looking I was never the passive party, only like some small boys who might be called professionals, and whom I used to pay for their services. I went back after I had left, and had a boy in the dark, whom I had never seen before, having been told that he was all right. I used to have a very genuine affection for any party to my pleasure, though I took delight in torturing one in particular, but for what reason I cannot say. For one boy, I developed a deep love which lasted long after we had left school, and had ceased all sexual connection. This love was as strong as anything I have ever felt since. I don't remember whether it was while I was at school or later that I first began again to take a sexual interest in animals. I used to masturbate a good deal, and was always trying to find new ways of doing it and new substances to lie on. It was while feeling the vulva of a young mare that the brilliant thought struck me of trying to copulate with her, and thus getting the advantage of the soft vagina. It afforded me great satisfaction, and I had an emission, though I did not then nor at any other time with any other animal succeed in penetrating properly. I afterward did the same with other mares. And with a certain cow, whenever I got a safe opportunity, which was not as often as I could have wished. I have not had connection with an animal for about 10 years, but would have no objection to doing so, and feel sure I could perform the act properly now. After I left school at 17, I occasionally had longings for boys, but it was the exception, and not the rule. I continued to masturbate, but not to excess, and used to make ineffectual efforts to stop it, but never succeeded for very long. When I was confirmed at the age of 15, I became intensely religious, and was so remorseful at my first lapse from virtue that I burnt my leg with a red-hot poker, and I bear the scar still. On leaving school, I went to Germany, and there had my first coitus with a woman, a fat old German who gave me very little satisfaction. My next, a Jewess, gave me more than I asked for in the shape of a soft canker. In my ignorance, I never had it treated, but it must have been very mild, for it disappeared of its own accord. When cramming in England, I occasionally went home with a prostitute, but did not care much about them, and could not afford good ones. On one occasion, I was impotent. It may have been through drink, but it disgusted me with myself. I liked seeing the women naked, and always insisted that they should strip, especially the breasts, which I liked large and full. I had not learned to kiss on the lips, and had no desire to kiss the body, except the breasts, which I was generally too shy to do. But as I nearly always wore a condom, and found penetration difficult, I did not much enjoy the actual coitus. I am fully convinced that if women had been more accessible, if I had not thought myself bound to use preventives in self-defense, and if the act had not been looked upon with such disfavor by those in authority over me, I should have masturbated less or not at all, and would not have been tempted to bestiality. When I was 22, I had coitus with a girl, who was not a prostitute. For the first time I was violently excited, and enjoyed it more than anything I had yet experienced, in spite of the facts that she would not undress, and insisted on withdrawal. Before emission, on one other occasion only have I had coitus with a non-professional unmarried woman. Shortly after this, I caught syphilis from a girl of the streets. I was circumcised and stayed in a private hospital for 6 weeks. It never went beyond the primary stage, and I have felt no ill effects from it, except that I have got a hydrocele in the right testicle. Of course, this incident necessitated the use of a condom on every occasion, and it greatly spoiled my pleasure. About this time, a brother officer older than myself made advances to me. He compared me to a Greek statue, and wanted to kiss me. I would have nothing to do with him, but was glad to have his confessions of homosexuality, and somewhat surprised to learn that he was not alone in the regiment. I afterward fell in love with his sister, and he married, and had children. He was bisexual in his inclinations, but was really in love with me for a short time. I had little to do with professionals, until I went to South Africa, and though I was fond of ladies' society, and liked by ladies, I looked upon them as something apart, especially married women, and never attempted to take liberties with them, though I used to with shopgirls etc. in my cramming days, and had often been in love in South Africa. I first began really to enjoy coitus, and on going to India continued to do so. In fact, I thought sexually of nothing else, and rarely masturbate. Perhaps once in 3 weeks I would go to brothels, wherever they were available: Durban, Cape Town, Colombo, Calcutta, Bombay, and at one time preferred black women to white. I used to have horrible orgies with my brother officers, and on one occasion I ordered 6 women to my bungalow in order to celebrate my birthday, and made a present of them to 5 of my friends after dinner. During this period, and until I went home, I rarely spoke to a lady, the chief exception being no one, a brother officer's wife, with whom I began to be in love. Shortly after the South African War, I fell violently in love with a young brother officer Z. It amounted to a passion, and I was forced to make overtures to him. He did not understand, being ignorant of homosexuality and quite virile, and would have nothing to do with me, though he was very nice about it. This lasted for about a year, and then, thinking no doubt that he had better stop it, as I was really making myself very ridiculous, and was mad with love, he threw me up altogether. I was intensely miserable for some time, and then I recovered, and we made it up, and are now firm friends. I still want to kiss and stroke him when I see him naked, but would do nothing more. I went home by way of Japan after several years' absence from home, taking the women of the eastern ports as I went, until I contracted gonorrhea in the Tokyo Yashiwara. I could not get rid of it, and arrived home in that state, having been deprived of the pleasure of trying several new races on the way. In consequence, in England, I rushed into a society which I had quit on such different terms, and it received me with open arms. I very soon began a flirtation with a married woman, and she completed my education in kissing, which had been begun by the Japanese harlots. I was just coming to the point with this woman when I met no one again, and my love for her was at once renewed. I told her so, but I knew that she did not return it. I then became attracted to a girl older than myself whom I had known all my life. I kissed her and fondled her breasts, but she would not allow anything else until one night when, in the train with her, I got my hand down farther than she intended. It ended in my performing cunnilingus on her first, and then obtaining satisfaction between her thighs, a large step to take after the former limitations previous to this. I had on several occasions obtained an emission, without meaning to, by lying on her fully dressed. She was aware of my disease, which by that time had become a gleet, and did not inconvenience me in any way from that time, until I went back to India. We went through the same performance whenever possible, I masturbating her sometimes with the finger, sometimes with the tongue, and having connection with various parts of her body including the breasts, but always with a condom on account of my disease. She used to strip for my edification, and we frequently spent the night in the same bed. I was attracted to her mentally, but not very much physically. That is to say that if circumstances had not thrown us together, I should never have picked her out from other girls as being sexually attractive to me. I returned to India, and to no one, though I kept faithful to no two in word and deed for 5 months. But gradually, the overmastering influence of no one reasserted itself over me, and then I met no three. We were attracted to each other at first acquaintance, and the attraction was mental and sexual. She was married and in love with another man. But that did not prevent her from kissing me. I felt her breasts, masturbated her, and had emissions by lying on her, but she drew the line at one thing, viz. Kissing on the lips, and I drew it at coitus. We arranged a trip together during which I went to bed with her, but never had coitus, though we both had frequent orgasms in other ways. Before starting on this trip, I had thought that I should not see no one again, and she let me kiss her to my unspeakable joy. Circumstances, however, intervened, and I went straight to no one. After parting with no three, told her all I had done, and then kissed her again, leaving her just before her real lover, with whom she was then living, arrived later. I returned again to no one, now in child to her lover. We lived together for 3 nights. In spite of this, she then went home, and I had no connection with any woman for 2 years, except one black woman, being consumed with love and worship for no one. I was much in society, but never had any luck. At the end of this time, I was traveling one night with a young officer, slight and effeminate, and preferring men to women, with whom I had been, until then, on friendly but not intimate terms. I watched him undress and go to bed, and then, having myself undressed, went over to his bunk and put my hand under his clothes. He at once responded, and I got into his bed, both of us being in a frenzy of passion and surprise. But I was fairly sure of my ground, or I would not have dared to take the risk. I used often to go to his bed after this, and on one occasion had coitus with a girl on a chair at a ball, and the next night with my young officer. I scarcely knew the girl and don't know her name now, but I took her measure, made her excited by manipulation and kissing, and then got her consent. I did not harm her, even if I had been the first, for orgasm occurred before I had penetrated beyond the lips. X surprised me by telling me that he had a connection with 3 other officers in my regiment, as well as with several others in the same station. He would not tell me their names, but I guessed easily enough. He used to drink heavily, and once I got into his bed when he was in a drunken stupor, and he was quite unaware that I was there for some time. I myself was drinking too much at this time, and was frequently drunk before dinner. In the hot weather that followed, I had one orgy in Bombay, which lasted 3 nights. I started on a Greek and a Pole, and finished up with a Japanese. 2 brother officers accompanying me afterward. I was much alone during the day in my bungalow, and used to become possessed by intense desire. I masturbated occasionally, but by this time took but little pleasure in it, always craving for the moist human vagina. I had often heard and myself quoted the Pathan proverb, women for breeding, boys for pleasure, melons for delight. And one day, when seeking for some novelty with which to masturbate, and my eye being caught by a melon put ready for me to eat, it flashed across me to try whether the proverb was in any way true. I found it most satisfactory, and practiced it several times after that. The papita pape, or papa, being the nearest approach to the human vagina, the opportune arrival of a fairly good-looking punka woman, however, put an end to this form of enjoyment by providing me with what I wanted. Soon afterward, I went home again, taking the Japanese at Bombay on my way. I had kept up a correspondence with no one all this time, But we had made a compact that whatever each did, until we met again was not to count, and I knew that she had had at least one liaison since our parting, and was in entire ignorance of the state of her feelings toward me. Therefore, while trying to arrange a meeting with her, I took the first thing that chance threw in my way, thinking a bird in the hand better than the off chance of a better one in the bush. This was no four with whom I spent 3 days at the seaside, after having first had coitus with her in my own home. While she was in the monthly state immediately on parting from her, I came home to receive no one. The first time we were alone she kissed me, and this was followed by mutual confessions and coitus. Though at first she said my affair was too recent, I agreed not to have connection again with no four, and kept to this, until when staying in the same house again with her, I was tempted beyond my powers. And I may add that she gave me no assistance in keeping this promise, of which she was fully cognizant. I at once wrote and confessed to no one, and she very naturally would have nothing more to do with me, but I managed to reconcile her, and we afterward lived together for 3 days in the country as well as in London. And in her own house meanwhile, no five had been making advances to me, which I could not well refuse, being a very old friend. Knows 4 and 5 were on one occasion staying together at my house, just after I had been faithless to no one. With no four I could not very well sleep with them both, so at the earnest entreaty of no four, I went to her room, first told her my reasons for not having connection with her, left her in tears, and then went and slept with no five. This is the only transaction I have ever concealed from no one, but no five knows my whole story, and accepts the situation of being only seconds so long as I give her satisfaction whenever possible. About this time I again met no three and kissed and masturbated her in a cab, but she would not allow me to go home with her at the bidding of no one. I now broke entirely with no four, to the great grief and astonishment of my sister, whose friend she was shortly after this. I again returned to India, where I quarreled hopelessly with no one, and I don't know to this day what my fault was, except that she had got tired of me. Her influence over me is however too great to be so easily broken, and I would return to her tomorrow, if she moved a finger in reconciliation during the following hot, whether I slowly, but surely, albeit quite unconsciously, obtained an influence over no six, and it ended by her falling desperately in love with me, and allowing me to do what I liked. I did not love her, and told her about no one, whose image always remained in the back of my vision, whatever I was doing. She also accepted the situation, and I don't think has any grievance against me. For my part, one have nothing but thanks and gratitude, and as much love as I am capable of to give her, and all the other women with whom I have had any sexual relations. The following is a short account of the above women. No one had coitus before marriage for love, and with full knowledge of the nature of the act, agreement with her husband not to have coitus, rigidly adhered to by both, has had connection with 5 other men, since marriage, very passionate but fatty and particular slow at producing orgasm, likes being in bed naked, and liked me once for having kissed her. Mons veneris, thin with undeveloped breasts, brilliant, good-looking, artistic, and highly intellectual, never masturbated, and did not know of homosexuality among women, very sensitive to touch on the pudenda. No two has had sexual relations, but never coitus with many men, mutually masturbated with one man, masturbated herself frequently, and took a long time to produce orgasm, even with cunnilingus, which delighted her immensely. After having it performed, she would stoop down and passionately kiss my lips, fond of prolonged kisses, during which the tongue played a prominent part. Tall and fully developed, but no looks, clever masculine brain, and strong physically, skillfully concealed her passionate nature, which however was long in developing, and was long kept in check by maidenly modesty. No three innocent before marriage, and hated her fiancé even to touch her, which feeling still persists, has had liaisons with many men and several miscarriages, one legitimate, others illegitimate, and one illegitimate child does not masturbate herself, but readily yields to its seduction, when performed by others. The most passionate woman I have ever met, good typical womanly figure, but thin and weak, not much looks, but very fascinating to men, clever and intellectual. No for coitus, only with her husband before myself, not very passionate. I know nothing about masturbation or homosexuality in her case. Very broad hips, large breasts, and well-developed nates, deserted by her husband, no children, rather foolish and weak-minded penetration, difficult owing to long labia majora. No five knows all about homosexuality of both sexes, and wants to know more about everything. Probably masturbates several children, in love with her husband at first, but now tired of him, and took to other men for variety, and because her husband had ceased to give her sexual pleasure, very passionate, has slow orgasm, likes nakedness and contact of body, very large vagina, broad hips, and full breasts, intellectual, but not so by nature, artistic and very musical. No. 6 absolutely innocent before marriage, was practically raped by her husband on her marriage night. This disgusted her with the whole performance, and she could not bear her husband's caresses during pregnancy. She was frightened, because she did not know what was going to happen. Roman 1e. How the child was going to be born, and no one enlightened her. Doctor, nurse, or mother did not know the meaning of the words sexual feeling, and never thought about sexual matters at all, until marriage. I roused her passion, put things in their true light, made her have an orgasm, and told her what it meant. The orgasms at first made her cry and nearly faint, and she thereafter became intensely passionate, very excited at cunnilingus, which I practiced on her more than once. She confessed that the orgasm was stronger and more complete during coitus than during masturbation, which relieved my mind. She volunteered to strip naked, and has but little shyness with me, cannot bear her husband, yet she admits that she was only half a woman before she knew me, but now regrets her marriage. Short, thin, and slight, with narrow hips, and no breasts, quick woman's wit but not intellectual. Of the prostitutes I have known, perhaps 60 in number. The Japanese easily take the palm. They are scrupulously clean, have charming manners and beautiful bodies, and take an intelligent interest in the proceedings. Also, they are not always thinking about the money. Perhaps the Kashmiris come next, though the Chinese run them very close. Some of the more expensive London women are bearable, but they are such harlots. The white women in the East are insupportable, and small wonder, for they consist of the dregs of the European and American markets. My list comprises English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, American, Bengali, Punjabi, Kashmiri, Kafir, Sinhalese, Tamil, Burmese, Malay, Japanese, Chinese, Greek, and Pole. I naturally prefer to satisfy myself with a woman, a friend, and a lady of my own class. But in the absence of the best, I gladly take the next best available down the scale from a lady, for whom I do not care. To prostitutes of all classes, in colors, men, boys, animals, melons, and masturbation, I would as cheerfully have connection with my sister, or any other female relative. I have frequent erotic dreams about the most extraordinary subjects, male and female relations, casual acquaintances of both sexes and animals. When I have got an intrigue in hand with a woman, I have no wish to masturbate, and often restrain myself when I know that I am going to have access before long to prostitutes. After coitus, it takes a long time before I am ready for the next, sometimes 2 hours. And the first is always very quick, nearly always too quick for the woman. With a strange woman, I have difficulty in maintaining erection at the instant of penetration, and this has often given me trouble. I know that most women like and few dislike being touched by me. My favorite colors are green and red, and I can whistle quite well. I would be very glad to know whether I may be considered sexually normal or not, but I do not desire any opinion on the morality of my acts, for the simple reason that without knowing all the circumstances, it would be impossible to judge. But I cannot help saying that I do not consider anything I have done is wrong in itself, and I am quite certain that I have never harmed in any way any of the ladies with whom I have had relations. I am certain, if I had made promises which I knew I could not keep, I might have married one of them. But the result would have been great unhappiness, to both quarrels and ultimate separation, or divorcing. She realized that, as well as I. Roman 999, I may seem egotistical in my attitude and assurance toward ladies, but I only speak the honest truth, and I know that no. 6, for instance, has only gratitude and worship to give me for having opened her eyes. I have made her promise to have intercourse with her husband as soon as she can bear it, and I have satisfied myself that I have not started her on the road to sexual perversion. So much in self-explanation. I may add that I do not deliberately seek affairs to cur, and that when they come my way, I do my utmost to use all consideration for the lady, thinking, as I do, that I owe them a far bigger debt than I shall ever be able to pay. History. Roman 14. J.E. Professional man, aged 32, public school and university education, in which he did well from age of 6 or 7, had strong sexual emotions, and from 9 sexually pleasurable dreams, though no emission. Till 12 or 13 he remembers the association of sexual excitement with whipping, either at sight or imagination of it, and this feeling was certainly shared by boys aged 9 to 12 at his private boarding school, and others at the public school. Later on, his nursemaid used to invent excuses for beating his nates with a long lead pencil when he was aged about 7, and he saw occasional whippings with clothes removed in the family nursery. When nearly 16, he was initiated into masturbation, which at once coincided with rapid mental development and success at school. He has practiced it ever since under same conditions and restrictions as marital intercourse. Religion has never acted as any restraint, and the best restraint to all young people in his opinion is to warn them on hygienic grounds. He became a freethinker at 17 partly on observing the inconsistency of religious persons in this connection. He was twice set upon by Catholics. When 16, who attempted mutual masturbation, he can vaguely remember some such warning, when very young from his mother. No intercourse with women, till age of 19, though strong homosexual feelings from 10 upward, associated with feminine youths. These feelings were quite distinct from feelings of affection and friendship for more virile youths. An attack of gonorrhea at 21 was followed by an operation for circumcision which had beneficial effects, but did not prevent an attack of syphilis at age of 23 caught, at a guaranteed state establishment, in France. Intercourse, almost always with prostitutes on prudential and worldly grounds, though what he approves would be greater laxity between boys and girls, with proper safeguards against undesired offspring. He is now happily married. He only indulges in masturbation at times when intercourse is impossible, for example childbirth. It is then practiced once or twice a week in the early morning overnight. It causes troubled sleep-brain activity and constipation. This seems ethically more desirable unless the wife were to condone physical infidelity, which she would not, and even then there might be risks of venereal disease. His general health and working power are in all respects excellent, as the venereal diseases were speedily and thoroughly cured. Homosexual feeling has entirely disappeared since marriage. History Roman 15 G Roman 500 English aged 60. My earliest essays in juvenile vice were due not so much to unguarded as to unguided ignorance. I slipped where my natural protectors suspected no danger, and I fell because I had never been warned of the treacherous nature of the ground before or soon after I was 7 years old. The example of an elder brother, who had lately begun to go to school as a day boy, initiated me into the mysteries of masturbation, which seemed to me then as harmless as it was fascinating, and the novel pleasure was almost daily indulged in after I had acquired sufficient dexterity to accomplish the act within a reasonable time, without a twinge of conscience either in that brother's company, or when alone decency demanded secrecy, in the gratification of what soon became an imperious desire. And the preliminary operations included almost from the first mutual fellatio and approximation of the excited organs. But similar privacy was very properly sought during the performance of other bodily acts associated with those less honorable members, and it appeared to me quite as natural and right for us to amuse ourselves together in that way, as for a married couple to hide their most intimate embraces from the observation of others. Indeed, I went farther than that, and even came to regard the absence of all shame between us as akin to the primeval innocence which Adam and Eve exhibited before the fall. I believed for long that we too were specially privileged, and possessed a peculiar sense, denied to other boys, for I had never heard of masturbation, till I learnt not the word indeed, but the thing itself. My curiosity about the real nature of sexual union, in the case of human beings, set my intelligence to work at the interesting problem, and by carefully studying certain parts of the Bible, Lempriere's classical and other dictionaries, as well as by persistently watching, when I could, the amorous proceedings of domestic animals, I learned enough to make its most prominent features pretty clear. Before I was 11 years of age, I was then all eagerness to have the opportunity of inspecting at close quarters the genitals of women or young girls, and a stay at the seaside when I was 12 made the latter at least feasible. When the shore was nearly deserted between 1 and 2 p. Roman 1000, the daughters of the fisherfolk used to besiege the bathing machines and disport themselves in the water, bathing and paddling in various stages of nudity. I would pretend that my whole attention was being given to the making of miniature tunnels in the sand, while all the time I slyly peeped at what I most desired to see, whether in front or from behind, as the dancing damsels stood upright or stooped, till their haunches were higher than their heads. I had already read something somewhere about the clitoris, and wanted especially to see it, but indistinct glimpses were all that I could obtain, nor was it until I visited an anatomical museum, which then existed at the top of the Haymarket in London, that I learned a good many years later from several life-sized models. There displayed the characteristic features of that part, as well as the abnormal modifications to which it is subject either congenitally or in consequence of profligate habits. I was 15, I think, when I first came to know that girls can masturbate as well as boys. Long after I had realized why the terms male and female are so distinguished, my imagination was occupied with the possible postures in which the act of copulation may be accomplished by a man and woman, from Horace, Lucretius, Martial, Aristophanes, and above all from Ovid's Ars Amatoria. I obtained much but not always very clear information. While still a schoolboy, this was supplemented later by photographic pictures from Pompeian brothels and photographs from life purchased at Florence, and gloated over one night with twice repeated masturbation, and afterward destroyed in a revulsion of shame. But while continuing to practice self-abuse with a certain degree of restraint indeed, but seldom less often than once or even twice a week, after I had been made fully aware of its perils by Dr. Adam Clark's alarming comments on Genesis, Romans 38:9, when I was about 12 or 13, I never had connection with a woman until I married somewhat late in life. This abstinence was not due to any frigidity of disposition, but from prudential and religious motives, and to some extent perhaps from the imperfect but genuine satisfaction afforded by solitary indulgence. My imagination, like that of young J. Rousseau, as set forth in his Confessions, was allowed free scope for its exercise, but in practice, I confined myself to what seemed to me comparatively innocent, as compared with fornication. I was never an unreserved exhibitionist like Rousseau, but I have on more than one occasion turned toward a hedge and pretended to make water when a girl had just passed me on the road showing a turgeon's cotta, if she should chance out of curiosity to look back, as once at any rate happened. I watched with interest the first indications of puberty in my own person. I had of course seen the pubic hair on many of my own sex. But I was 17 when I first saw a naked woman. She was standing at the door of her machine, wringing out her bathing dress, as I swam past, and her face was hidden by the awning, then used so that she could not see me. A slight effusion of limpid mucus began to characterize the orgasm at the age of 12 or 13, before any ejaculation of semen was experienced, such as exuded later from the urethra, when salacious excitement reached a certain pitch. Even though the final climax might be postponed or prevented altogether, I found it a refinement of luxury to prolong the period of tumescence as far as possible, by frequently checking a too rapid progress toward the goal by this practice of repeated arrest when the orgasm was imminent, and the mental debauchery which was its habitual accompaniment. I believe I did my nervous system more damage than by anything else. Of in the early age at which the dangerous indulgence became established, nocturnal emissions, the sequel of lascivious dreams, commenced when I was about 15, at which age I had my first experience of an involuntary discharge, when awake under the influence of purely mental emotion. But this latter mode of escape did not often happen, and later on ceased altogether. My muscular strength was not impaired by too frequent indulgence, and I acquired some athletic prowess on the football field and on the running path. Both as a boy and as a young man, walking tour were for long my favorite recreation, even after the bicycle became an increasing attraction. My health, however, suffered in other ways from too constant absorption in lustful thoughts, which found vent in erotic verses and tales generally destroyed soon after they were written. I have been subject, since I was a boy, to more or less prolonged fits of mental depression. How far I have inherited this tendency, my father and his father both married first cousins, and a neurotic diathesis has been characteristic of our family, or how far it has been aggravated by pernicious habits, I cannot say. Cause and effect have no doubt acted and reacted on each other. As I grew toward adolescence, I endeavored to make self-abuse as close an imitation as possible of sexual intercourse, by such methods as may be easily imagined. My biological studies, I won a scholarship, and took honors at my university, were directed with most intent predilection toward the reproductive system, particularly modifications of the copulatory organs in different animals, and the diverse manner of their employment. The sexual instinct, whether in its normal or abnormal manifestations, is a subject which has always had a strong attraction for me, nor has it lost its fascination with the growth of years. I am now 60, nor the competition of other interests. My very limited experience of the sexual system in women would lead me to believe that the clitoris is the only peculiarly sensitive part of the female genitalia, coition, giving no pleasure, unless the trigger of love is simultaneously manipulated, as can be done when intromission is effected a tergo that the mind of a normally healthy maiden is altogether free from sexual excitement of a physical kind, and that little curiosity is felt about the precise modus operandi of conjugal intercourse. But nevertheless, I have good reason to believe that this, if not an unusual type, is by no means the only one that exists. As to sexual inversion, my personal experience has been confined to 2 or 3 grand passions, for boys, the first of which possessed me when between the ages of 16 and 18, and involved when I was 17, the most intense mental emotion of a romantic kind, tinged with poignant jealousy and vexation at comparative coldness toward myself. These love passages never led me into indelicate behavior. I was once threatened with such treatment myself, by a stranger whose acquaintance I made one day at the British Museum. When a lad of 15, he took me to his bedroom at an inn, locked the door, and showed me a collection of coins, giving me some, and while doing so attempted to take indecent liberties. But I pretended that I must catch a certain train, unlocked the door, and made a hasty escape, nor was any gratification sought beyond occasional kisses and other innocent endearments, though such caresses would sometimes excite an erection, which I carefully concealed. These amours were however no outcome of perverted instinct, nor were they any bar to fancies for the opposite sex, which affected my imagination rather than my heart. History, Romans 16. This history is given in the subject's own words. A n 34 years of age, a university graduate devoted to learning and interested in philosophy and theology, he is happily married, and the father of an only daughter. Since puberty, he has enjoyed excellent health. Looking back, he finds the beginnings of sexual feeling obscure. This feeling is by no means identical in its progress with the knowledge of the phenomena of sex. Generally, the latter he acquired, thus his mother told him at a very early age the outlines of the phenomena of birth, and explained to him, perhaps at that time unnecessarily, that the genital organs of little girls were different from his own. This piece of knowledge led to his asking, when 9 years old, a little girl cousin who came to live with the family. He was an only child, and who shared his bed, to let him see her genitalia. This she readily did, and also invited him to coitus, which she described as a nice game. He complied, but without, of course, any feeling of pleasure or any understanding of the nature of what he was doing. Shortly after this, he went to a day school where, amid the extraordinarily coarse conversation of the boys, he was initiated into all the more obvious phenomena of sex. But still, it was only a matter of intellectual curiosity. As such, it had a strange fascination for him, and to this day, he remembers many of the obscene words and phrases, as for example a set of indecent verses beginning, "William, the milkman sat under a tree," describing coitus, though some of the details were yet misunderstood by him. That up to his 10th or 11th year no real sexual desire was awakened is plain from the fact that there was no desire for any repetition of attempts at coitus with his cousin, though he did indeed again, out of curiosity, finger her genitals, sometimes a thing which she, grown evidently more fastidious, reported to his mother, who gravely reprimanded him, telling him that it was the beginning of all evil. Desire was awakened gradually, and as I have said, obscurely, not only at school, but among his own cousins, especially 2 girls other than the one above mentioned, and a boy. The conversation was lascivious in the extreme, though words never proceeded to deeds as between the boys and the girls. He was soon, however, about his 15th year, so far as he can remember, initiated into the practice of masturbation, first sleeping with his boy cousin. The 2 used to play at husband and wife, and then more directly a neighbor, a heavy sensual type of boy, took him aside one day, and drawing out his own penis asked him if he knew how to make some buttermilk, out of curiosity at first, and to obtain the new and voluptuous sensation. Afterward, he began assiduously to practice this vice, which, as he afterward found out, was very common, if not universal, about him. That it was morally reprehensible, he had not at that time the ghost of a notion. He considered that it belonged to the category of the dirty. Only his father quite neglected this development, believing, I suppose, in the superstition of the innocence of childhood. This practice of masturbation went on assiduously to his 16th year, when its true nature and danger were revealed to him by a good clergyman, who prepared him for confirmation. He had at this time gone far in both solitary vice and vice adieu with his male cousin, with whom he practiced even fellatio and intromissio in anum, but now he began to struggle against it and made some headway, but never entirely shook it off before his marriage at 26, so deeply rooted, was the hold it had on him, especially at the time between sleeping and waking, or while lying sleepless at night when the monks prayed ne polluenter corporatidits. Attacks come insidiously upon him, he would struggle for weeks, and then would come a relapse on one occasion. He slept with a young uncle, who amused himself thinking he was asleep by playing with his penis, until he had an emission. A.N. hailed the occasion with keen joy, caustically argued that he experienced the pleasure without being culpable in its production. Then, on coming to himself, he would agonize over his vice, remembering, for example, that while he had rejoiced in what had been done, the very cousin who some time before used to share his sin was genuinely annoyed at the same uncle's attentions when it was he who suffered them. Looking back over the whole period of his youth and adolescence, he can trace the psychological effect of what was going on secretly in his relations to girls and women. In a word, these relations were sentimental. Only, he often imagined himself in love. But it was imagination, only he was in love with a wraith, not a girl of flesh and blood. He hesitated to regard in any sexual way any girl of whom he had a high opinion. Sexual desire and love seemed for him to inhabit different worlds, and that it would be a pollution to bring them together in hours of relaxation from the very hard intellectual work, which he was at this time engaged on at school, and at the university he was quite content with the society of quite young girls or even children, when most of his friends would have sought out females of their own age. Nothing could have been farther from his desires or intention than any lascivious or indeed unseemly act toward any female in whose company he might be. No mother need have hesitated to trust her daughter in his company. I firmly believe that the discipline of the same bed which Gibbon decline and fall ed Barry vol Roman 2 p. 37 makes so merry over could have been endured by him without difficulty. His outward conduct was in all these respects most seemly and decorous, yet night after night he could masturbate his imagination, glowing with visions of female nakedness. Curiously, the one and only actual female for whom he felt any desire at the earlier period, aged 14 to 16, began to be the cousin who lived in the house. On one occasion, he touched her breasts, on another her naked thighs, and that was all. As she grew to puberty, she would have allowed far more liberties, but he contented himself with a sly glance now and again, when he could procure it at her swelling bosom. The fear of putting her with child was ample to keep him away from her bed later on. Even so much as the foregoing occurred no more, and as I have said, his outward life became absolutely decorous. Consequently, he was in no danger of having dealings with prostitutes. The preliminaries, the conversation of such women, especially their drinking habits, would have been disgusting and repugnant to him. In the extreme, he would have shunned the possibility of acquiring venereal disease like the plague. But he was never free from solitary vice. He secretly envied those who had occasions for coitus, in what I may call a seemly and cleanly manner, friends in the country with farm girls, etc., of whom he had heard. He indulged also in lascivious reading, the obscene when he could procure it, rather than the merely suggestive, which has never been to his taste. He was familiar with quite a large number of Latin and Greek indecent passages, knew the broader farces of the Canterbury Tales, and of the Decameron, and later the Contes of La Fontaine, and the Fasti of Poggio, as Steve Beauve says of Gibbon. I think he acquired an erudite and cold sort of obscenity in this way. All this, of course, is only one half and by no means always the dominant half of his nature. He was often repentant for these delinquencies, and he was sincerely religious. He was also fond of serious learning, and contrived to take a first-class university degree, yet ever and anon the deeply sensual side of his nature made itself felt. Scotched for a time it could be, but killed never. Yet I do not think it could be said that he had the sexual instinct in any really high degree. It was more like a small fly that makes a large buzz than any considerable factor in his constitution. He had a companion about this time of whom such a remark is even more true. This man's mind was replete with all manner of risky stories, all sorts of sexual details. He would take long walks with girls of loose character, talk with prostitutes at home and abroad, and yet I believe he never proceeded to coitus. Such then was the subject of this notice up to the time of his marriage. Two men, one might say in one skin, one learned, one merely obscene, one a pattern of decorousness, the other a self-polluter. On the sexual side, he was as one knowing everything there is to know yet knowing nothing, like the boy hero in Wedekind's Frühlings Urwaschen. He had been long in Egypt, yet he had never seen the pyramids. he began to distress himself with questions as to whether he was yet capable, whether his recurring vice had not permanently injured him, whether he had made himself unfit for marriage so shy and reserved. Was he about his secret that he could never have brought himself to mention it to a medical man? What he the good, the religious, the holy, moral, and decorous such? Was indeed the reputation he had among his friends. He the victim of a vice, so black, no secretum mea mihi, he cried. Fortune, however, was kind to him. He was at an early age free from financial worries, which had almost crushed him earlier in his career, and he met in course of time the family from which he selected his excellent wife. The society in which he lived was of all English classes, I should suppose the most reticent in matters of sex, respectable lower middle-class shopkeepers, and the like with a tradition of homely religion and virtue. The classes, a little higher in the scale, to which by the way his mother had belonged, could far better sympathize with one in his position. Well, the family of his future wife was of a higher class, and what is far more of foreign origin, for whom a large number of our English convenances do not exist to them. Sex was frankly recognized as a factor in life, and the mother of this household, as he grew more intimate, broached subjects which he had never in such a manner discussed before. It is unnecessary to give here any general history of his relationships with this household, as they have nothing to do with the matter in hand. After some time, he became engaged to the youngest daughter, 2 years his senior, a woman of remarkable beauty and splendid development, one who attracted him, as none other had done, both on account of her intellectual and social qualities, and her physical beauty. He had hitherto despaired of finding the two combined in one person, for she is certainly the most beautiful woman with whom he has ever been acquainted. He now began to make the practical acquaintance of a woman, and one who in impulses, temper, manner, and habit of thought differed toto quo from the girls he had known in his old home. Her sexual nature was ripe and developed, and it is lucky that the engagement was of short duration, or the strain and anticipation of that time might have been injurious to the health of both. As usual in his outward relations toward women, so toward his fiancée, he was prepared for chaste caresses. Only this, however, did not suffice for her hot and passionate nature. They went as far as possible short of actual coitus. After a few months, however, the marriage took place, and at first this brought him bitter disappointment, and seemed to confirm his worst fears. He found himself quite unable to have pleasure or satisfactory coitus, quite incapable with any erection that he could command of introducing his well-developed penis into his wife's extremely narrow and contracted vagina. About a fortnight after the marriage, however, on his return from their short wedding tour, he felt much stronger, and copulated with her, especially in the early mornings, so satisfactorily that she soon found herself with child. Coitus now began to be much more pleasurable for him, but to his wife still attended with pain. After 9 months of married life, the child, the only offspring of the marriage, a healthy girl, was born. The stress of this time, the upsetting of his wife's health, her nervous breakdown, and consequently uncertain temper, seemed for a period of nearly 2 years effectually to repress any sexual desire in the husband, and this period is perhaps the chastest of his life. Desire seemed to be the one thing absent. The revulsion of feeling in his wife was remarkable. The erstwhile amorous fiancée, who could hardly wait until marriage to test her lover, became now the wife and mother who hardly wished to be touched by her husband. Her health, however, gradually improved, and a more normal state of affairs was brought about, which has continued to the present day, broken only by periods of abstention, chiefly caused by the attacks of anemia and menstrual irregularities from which his wife suffers from time to time. Ordinarily, he enjoys coitus once or twice in the month, hardly oftener, taking 1 month with another at one time. He exemplified in his own person the saying omni animal post coitum trist, but now happily this depression of spirits is rarely felt. Sometimes he has felt a depression of spirits, a general discontentedness, before experiencing a strong erection. In these cases, coitus has cleared his spirits. He would naturally look upon coitus as an evacuation, although he recognizes the imperfectness of that view. For one thing he is constantly sorry, viz., that the act gives no pleasure to his wife, and that he has never been able to induce a crisis with her by normal means in this state of affairs. Knowing that après coup she was still unsatisfied, he slipped into the practice of rubbing the clitoris with his fingers until the emission takes place. To do this, they assume the position Ellis sub Ellis super. From his own limited marital experience, He has never been able to understand the stories of women who masturbate several times a day, as his wife would be physically incapable, so he believes of anything of the kind, and only easily reaches the crisis in any circumstances during the first few days after the menstrual flow has ceased in fine, while agreeing theoretically with Sir Richard Burton and others that the Eastern style of coitus directed with a view to the pleasure of your partner is the right one. It is one of his standing regrets that he is unable to practice it in the place of the 20 minutes required by the women of India. According to Burton, he is happy if he can give 2 or 3 at the most, much as he would wish to prolong a pleasure as keen to himself as he could desire it to be to his dear and excellent spouse. History Roman 17 R Roman 50 American, aged 43, height 5'7", in weight about 145 pounds, occupation teacher, somewhat neurotic, a slight myopia, associated with acute astigmatism, and muscular weakness of the eyes, producing a tendency to migraine, uric acid diathesis, producing occasionally severe neuralgia, particularly in the intestines. These symptoms have been more or less constant since very early childhood. General health very good, not inclined to indulge in athletic sports, but prefers sedentary occupations and recreations. My early ideas of sexual things are not very clear in recollection. I think that when 7 or 8 years of age, I had a knowledge of the common or vulgar terms for intercourse, and for the genital organs. Boys of my own age and slightly older would discuss sex relations, and I had a general knowledge that in some way connected with the sexual act babies were made. We would tell occasionally lewd stories, and a few times attempted sexual practices with one another. Not till after puberty did I ever attempt masturbation. I must have been 9 or 10 years old before I learned that there was a difference in the sex organs of boys and girls. Up to this time, I had supposed that intercourse was per annum. I attended a public school with both sexes. Talk among my boy associates was often nasty and concerned the sexual act with girls. At about 12 years, I began to have erotic daydreams. I always had a sentimental attachment for some acquaintance whom I would idealize, and with whom I would imagine myself having sex relations. As a matter of fact, there was no real sexual feeling about this, as I was very shy and timid. Naturally, I never made any kind of advances toward any of them, and they were entirely ignorant of any sentiments of affection in me. Pubertal changes commenced, I presume, about the age of 13-12 years. I place it at this period from the following circumstances, which are fixed very strongly in my memory. I had as a child a soprano voice that was praised considerably by older friends, and about which I was inordinately conceited. I enjoyed greatly taking part in operettas, cantatas, etc. The dramatic instinct, if so it may be called, has always been marked with me, and amateur dramatics are still my chief diversion. When I was about the age mentioned above, my voice changed quite rapidly, greatly to my distress of mind, as I was obliged to give up taking a part for which I had been cast in a school entertainment. The memory of that disappointment is still poignant. Other changes, such as the appearance of the pubertal hair, must have made no impression on my mind, as I cannot recollect anything in connection therewith. No involuntary emissions occurred. Indeed, during periods of continence in later life, when the sexual tension has been very strong, I have had very few such emissions. As a lad of 11 or 12, I had heard frequent allusions to masturbation by other boys who were older, but always in a way that indicated contempt. Yet there is no doubt now in my mind that the practice was very general. I think that I was probably about 15 when I decided to try the act. I think that there was little sex impulse in this decision. The animating purpose was rather curiosity. I succeeded in producing the complete orgasm, and found it pleasurable, though there was a considerable shock of surprise at the ejaculation of semen. As nearly as I can estimate in my memory of an event, as far back as this was the beginning of definite sexual sensibility in me. I cannot but believe, however, that it would have been aroused sooner or later in some other way thereafter. I would imagine myself embracing some of the girl friends to whom I have referred above, and when excited would masturbate. The act was in every instance a psychic intercourse for some time. I did not know that the practice was considered harmful. I indulged whenever I felt the inclination. This at times was rather frequent, again only at considerable intervals. I did know that it was looked upon as being unmanly, and never admitted, except to perhaps 2 or 3 boy friends, that I ever indulged with these boys. I practiced mutual masturbation a few times, There was no homosexual feeling connected with these acts. In any of us, it was only that the normal method of gratifying our desires was not available. I know the subsequent history of each of these boys, and there has been nothing to indicate any perverted instinct in any of them about the age of 16. I heard a talk on sexual matters by a traveling evangelist who portrayed the effects of masturbation in fearful colors. I now realize that he was an ignorant though well-intentioned man. But the general effect of his talk upon me was a bad one. One of the results of the habit, according to his statements, was insanity. Therefore, I expected at any moment to lose my mind. I felt that I must stop the practice at once. But the matter became so great an obsession that again and again, I broke my resolutions for reform. I undertook exercise, dieting, the reading of serious literature, all of which I had seen referred to in books as methods of lessening sexual desire. The object of these disciplinary practices was always the thing most prominently in mind. And so they were of no avail. Fortunately, I entered college a little later, and the affairs of school life gradually took a commanding place in my thoughts, and the practice was not so much in mind. I did not, however, completely break away from it until almost the time of my marriage. If the present attitude of the scientific medical world toward the subject had been known to me, I do not believe that any evil would have come to me from the practice. At a later period of my life, say between 21 and 24, I would not indulge the habit for a considerable interval. At times, I did not notice the presence or lack of desire. But then there would come periods when I would be under a severe sexual tension. This would be marked by intense nervousness, an inability to fix my attention upon any one thing, and a great desire to have intercourse. An act of masturbation at such a time would generally give relief. However, when I yielded to this form of relief, there would always follow feelings of profound self-reproach and of self-repugnance. Had I had nocturnal emissions, they might have relieved me, but as I have said before, they very rarely occurred. When rarely one did occur, I would be greatly frightened, for I had the old erroneous idea that they meant serious weakness, and always ascribed them to my bad habit. That my habit of masturbation had any relation to the rarity of the involuntary emissions would of course be a matter of pure conjecture. In passing from the discussion of personal masturbation, I wish to say that my associations with boys, as a pupil and as a teacher, lead me to believe that the practice is practically universal. When discussing the hygienic evils of prostitution with boy pupils, I have noted that whereas not infrequently a boy will voluntarily protest that he has never had intercourse, there has always been a significant silence when masturbation is mentioned. I have never heard a boy make a denial, direct or indirect, that he had indulged in the practice. But it has seldom been a perversion. It has rather been, as in my own case, an available means of relieving a sexual impulse. During my college life, I associated with many boys who had more or less regular sexual relations with prostitutes, or with girls who were not virtuous. Their attitude toward the practice was an immoral one. The ethical aspect of irregular sexual relations never concerned them. It certainly did not concern me. What I have learned through my conversations on the subject with my pupils makes it evident to me that this is the common feeling of most boys of the adolescent period. I think of two things which operated strongly to prevent my entering into sexual relations with girls during this period of my life. One was an aesthetic repugnance to the average prostitute. These are the women most easily available to the youth, whose sexual desires are developed. I do not remember ever having seen an avowed prostitute who did not seem repulsive to me. I confess to an inclination to priggishness. I preferred to associate with people whom I called nice people. It was fortunate for me that I was thrown into the society of a rather rough crowd of youths, who knocked a great deal of this snobbishness out of me, but it did act to prevent my having recourse to prostitution. A second preventive was my natural timidity in making advances to people. This has been a trait that I have never completely overcome in my professional life. This has been some detriment to my advancement. In the matter of sex relationship, it tended to prevent my taking advantage of association with, and even of advances from, girls who, not prostitutes, were nevertheless not virtuous. There were a number of such in the town and neighborhood in which I lived, and I undoubtedly could have had sexual relations with them if I had only been able to overcome my shyness. The desire was not wanting. I really craved intercourse with them. It was simply a matter of cowardice. There was one girl whom I knew very well, with whom I was on friendly terms, who I knew had had sexual relations with other boys, she showed at times a marked preference for me, and I am sure would have welcomed any advances that I should have made. A number of times I sought her company with the intention of suggesting intercourse, but my resolution always failed. All through my college course I was much in the society of girls. We were in class together, associated very freely in society, frequently studied together. This is the most usual state of things in the western part of our country, but they were simply comrades. Sex thoughts never arose in connection with such association, and I am quite certain that this was the general attitude of the other boys, although the talk among the boy students was at times very frankly and crudely about sexual relations. No breath of scandal ever touched one of the college girls. Again, my experience as teacher and student brings a conclusion that coeducation of the sexes does not affect in one way or the other the strictly sexual life of the male student. A very intimate friend, who has had a varied experience in schoolwork, has told me recently that his conclusions are the same. When I was about 20 years old, I became acquainted with a very beautiful girl, 4 years my junior. Our acquaintance very rapidly developed into deeper affection, and about 5 years later, we were married. During all this time, very little of the physical aspects of love entered into our attachment. My sweetheart had much of the same shyness as was so pronounced in my own character for several years. I think that the thought of marriage was never distinctly present in our minds. A formal betrothal between us did not take place until within a year and a half of our marriage, yet each of us had a very distinct understanding of the feelings of the other. But until our betrothal, there were none of even those very innocent expressions of endearment common, I imagine, to all lovers. I am sure that during this period of our attachment, no thought of any physical relations between us was ever in my mind, or at any rate was promptly banished, if it occurred. Yet all this time, my sex desires were very strong, and at times became an obsession. Never though were they directed toward my sweetheart. The first time that we engaged in the endearments and caresses allowed to lovers, I became conscious, after a time, of a state of sexual excitement. I experienced an erection. It was absolutely reflex. No thought had entered into it. I was at once overwhelmed with a feeling of shame. I felt that I had been guilty of unthinkable indecency toward my betrothed. Then there arose a fear that it might be noticed. Men at that time wore abominably tight clothing. As a matter of fact, I now know that there was no real danger of this, for she was absolutely ignorant of the nature of the male sexual organs. But I made a pretext for withdrawing from the room and tried to adjust my clothing so that no exposure could occur. I was fearful of coming into close proximity to her again, lest there should be a recurrence of the feeling. As a matter of fact, it did occur a number of times, but my good sense finally suggested the explanation, and after a time it ceased to trouble me. The thought was latent in my mind that sexual excitement was necessarily more or less indecent at all times, and I could not reconcile its manifestation with a pure. I have said that my sexual desire was strong up to the time of marriage. It was never gratified in the normal manner. My aesthetic abhorrence of prostitutes continued to prevent its gratification in that manner. No other opportunity offered. I am positive that moral considerations did not enter into the matter at all. I think now that it was strange that the thought that it would be disloyal to my promised wife to have connection with other women did not affect me, but I am sure that it did not. I am inclined to think that conscientious scruples very rarely enter into the average young man's considerations of contemplated sexual relations. As the time of my marriage drew near, thoughts of the physical relationship of husband and wife became, of course, more insistent. The idea of establishing sexual relations was not at all a pleasant one. I dreaded it as an ordeal. I wondered if it would be possible for us to retain the same love and affection for one another after such intimate relations were established. This was a recurrence of the fallacious notion that there was something inherently indecent in sexual things. I am in hopes that other ideas are replacing this wrong one in the minds of the younger generation. As the result of the saner and franker discussion of sex, by a great effort, I had practically stopped masturbating. At times, I felt almost maddened by desire, but never did the prospect of marriage seem desirable. From this point of view, up to the very day of our wedding, my affection for my betrothed seemed free from sexual desire, but my physical being was craving sexual companionship. Theoretically, I knew a great deal of the nature of intercourse. Practically, I was absolutely ignorant in some ways. I was better informed on matters that a new husband should know than the average man entering the married life. A physician's library had been at my disposal, and I had read somewhat extensively on physiology and hygiene. My chosen lines of study had given me a theoretical knowledge of the anatomy of the female genital organs that was fairly thorough. I knew a little about the physiology of reproduction, and rather less of intercourse. Fortunately, I learned in the course of my reading that the first sexual approaches were likely to be quite painful to a woman, and that great care should be exercised at this time. I tried to put into practice what little I had learned in theory, and I imagine that we got through the introductory attempts with less than the average difficulties. Our first efforts were not satisfactory to either of us. My wife was absolutely unprepared, so far as any definite knowledge of the act was concerned. I sincerely hope that the prudish notions of the past generations will give way to more sensible views in the future, and that the girl becoming a wife will be just as chaste, but wiser in matters of such importance to her happiness. I presume that my timidity was a valuable asset at this time, for I was afraid to force matters in any way, and time and repeated attempts finally overcame our difficulties. And when our sexual relations were once established, the whole tenor of my life was changed. All the former sexual unrest disappeared. My former feeling towards sexual relations was altered. They no longer seemed that which, though very desirable, was yet necessarily indecent. Fortunately, after the first few weeks they have been quite pleasurable to my wife. I am sure that our sexual life since marriage has been a large factor in deepening the love that has made our married life an ideal one. As I look back at the first year of marriage, I wonder that we got through it so well. My knowledge of sexual hygiene was a strange mixture of fact and nonsense. If the frequency of acts of intercourse advocated by some of the authorities I have lately read is correct, then we must have passed the bounds of moderation. But it is certain that our general health has been very good, better in both cases than before marriage. In reviewing these phases of the development of my sexual life, one or two conclusions seem to me to be strongly emphasized. It was unfortunate that the real sexual desire was aroused as early, and in the manner that it was. Whether this would have been prevented by more definite education in the hygiene and the purpose of the function, I can only conjecture. I believe that mine was, and is, the common experience of boys. I am decidedly of the opinion that there should be instruction given of the anatomy of the genital organs and of the hygiene of intercourse, and this shortly after the youth has reached puberty. How this is to be done is a grave question. It will require tact and knowledge not possessed by the average teacher and parent. However it is done, it should be honest, frank, and free from piosity. I am certain that in my own case, rather frequent intercourse is decidedly beneficial. Any prolonged abstinence always brings about the same nervous disturbances that I have referred to above. It is fortunate for me that this repetition of the act is satisfactory to both concerned. History. Roman 18 E.W. dentist, aged 32, of New England, Puritan stock, height 5 ft 10-12, in weight 144 pounds spare, and active, of nervabilious temperament. My earliest recollection is being punished for playing with myself when I could not have been more than 3 or 4 years of age. I distinctly remember my exultation on discovering that I could excite myself while my hands were tied behind my back for punishment by rubbing my small but erect penis against the carpet while lying on my stomach. At this time, of course, I knew nothing of sex or of what I was doing. I did what my desires and instincts at that time prompted me to do. However, punishments and lectures failed utterly to break up this habit, and though I always wished and tried faithfully to obey my parents, I soon grew to indulge quietly in bed. When I was thought to be asleep, the matter apparently passed out of the minds of my parents as soon as they ceased to detect me further in the act, and they regarded it as abandoned. I now feel reasonably certain that this precocity was due to an adherent foreskin, which covered the glands tightly almost to the meatus, and so kept up a continual irritation. I have no recollection that anyone ever taught me the habit, and I know beyond a doubt that no one ever learned of the habit, or even a word, as to the possibility of auto-excitement through word or deed of mine. My recollection of the sensations is that there was a short period of excitation, usually by rubbing, which was not particularly often not at all pleasurable, and this was followed by a single thrill of pleasure that extended all over my little body. The curious thing was, however, that there seemed to be no limit to the number of times I could consecutively produce this sensation. My recollection is perfectly clear of how I would lie in bed of a morning, and thus excite myself time after time as I grew older. This condition of course changed masturbation, was not a consuming passion with me at this, or any other time. I enjoyed it, and felt that in it I had a means of entertainment, when other sources of enjoyment were not at hand. By the time I was 6 or 7, I had figured out the difference in sex in animals, and suspected that all was not as it should be in some portions of a girl's anatomy. This suspicion was suddenly confirmed one never-to-be-forgotten morning, when I induced my dearest playmate, a little girl, to urinate in my presence. I was more thunderstruck than excited over this discovery, and it led to no results in any other way, nor did we ever again unveil ourselves to each other at this time. I began to learn from the older boys the pitiful childish vulgarities and common terms of sex, and to invent and exchange rhymes and stories that were pathetic in their attempts at vulgarity. At the age of 11, a buxom servant girl threw out some vague hints to me. I was very tall for my age and tried to induce me to take liberties with her, at least to the extent of telling her vulgar stories. But I would not rise to the lure. I believed that the thing which held me in check was fear of discovery by my parents, and the consequent humiliation. A short time previous to this, my father had enlightened me as to the means and manner of reproduction, and had encouraged me to talk to him and to my mother on such subjects rather than with anyone else. I think this had a great influence for good, as it made me feel that I had some authoritative knowledge, and that I was trusted by my parents. My determination not to prove entirely unworthy of their trust has been the anchor that has held through all the storms and temptations of youth and young manhood. About the age of puberty, I began to long for more realistic experiences, and tried through a period of a year or so the disgusting experiments of intercourse with animals using hens and a cow for this purpose. Details are of no importance, and I spare myself their repetition. My better nature or general mental development soon overcame my desires in this direction, and the practice was abandoned. With the dawning of the power of emission, I noticed that the adherent foreskin before alluded to, which had never been examined during all these years, as I had discovered that I was different from other boys, and so was shy about exposing myself, began to trouble me by being painful during erections. Accordingly, I took a button-hook and tore all the adhesions loose, a very painful, though ultimately entirely satisfactory operation. I may mention in this connection that my 2 sons were afflicted with adherent foreskins to such an extent as to render circumcision necessary a few days after birth, in order that the function of urination might become fully established. As my powers developed, I had my first wet dream at about the age of 15, and was much surprised thereat. My father, however, told me not to be alarmed, and soothed my anxious fears, which were easily aroused by my guilty feelings, on account of my habit of masturbation, in which I still indulged from 1 to 3 times a week. Between the ages of 12 and 17, my father had the good judgment to require a large amount of active outdoor labor from me, as well as sending me to excellent schools. Certain kinds of study had a distinct effect upon the sexual organs, namely difficult Latin and German translations and problems in fractions. I considered at the time that it was because my mind wandered from the subject I was studying. Now, I am perfectly sure it was because my mind focused on the subject I was studying. At any rate, the fact existed, and when alone in my room wrestling with a knotty problem, I used almost as a rule to keep myself in the most violent state of erection for long periods, an hour, or so, sometimes ending with an emission, but more often I forced myself to forego this climax through fear of overindulgence. During these years, my curiosity as to the exact nature of the female organs was something terrible, and I wasted many hours and much ingenuity in the attempt to surreptitiously gratify it. My perseverance in the face of failure along this line was surely worthy of a nobler cause. I was much in the society of girls of my own age or older during these years, and until I was 19 I found with them a keen and entirely pure and wholesome enjoyment, utterly separate and apart from the desires and indulgences which I have been describing. I never cared for any girl who was forward, or in any way unladylike, and the idea of taking any undue liberties with any of my youthful sweethearts was as remote from my thoughts as a trip to the moon. Perhaps I can say this better and more distinctly by stating that I would be perfectly willing to have my wife know of, or my boys repeat, any action that I ever took with any woman. I spent my spare time in their society, and lavished upon my girl companions every cent I could spare, but had no thought of immediate sex desire or gratification at the age of 17. I went as an apprentice in my present profession of dentistry, whenever it became necessary for me in assisting at the operating chair, to touch ladies' hair or face. I would be seized with the utmost confusion, and could with difficulty control my hands, so that they did not tremble. This soon wore off, as I came to a realization of the true professional spirit and attitude toward all patients, and needless to say, has now become a matter of the utmost indifference to me. From 19 to 22, I attended a professional school in a large city remote from my home, where I was an utter stranger during these years. I devoted myself to my professional studies, and to music with much diligence. I took an active part in all student life and problems, save only that of the eternal feminine. Frequently, I have been out with a crowd of the boys when they headed for a brothel, and have been the only one to turn back or to remain on the sidewalk, as the door closed behind my last companion. I say this not in self-praise, but in the same spirit of accuracy, which has prompted me to put down everything concerning this greatest mystery of our natures, as I have experienced it, and worked it out. It was during these 3 years at school that I placed upon myself the most stringent and effective curbs to my sex nature. I somehow never could get my own consent to go to a brothel or stay with a soiled dove, for I had by this time firmly resolved that I would bring to my wife, whoever she might turn out to be, a clean body. At least I limited myself in my auto-excitement to 1 emission a week, and on 1 or 2 occasions went 2 weeks without inducing an emission. Spontaneous nocturnal emissions were quite common during these years. I cannot state just how frequent they were, but perhaps 1 a week would be a fair average. Shortly after graduation at the age of 22, I became engaged to the woman who is now my wife. She was 17 at the time of our engagement, brunette, well-developed, and with a wisdom and charm that have held me a willing captive for 10 years, and no prospect of escape. With our engagement began for each of us that divine and mysterious unfolding of the nature of one to the nature of the other. Our engagement lasted 2 years and a half, and ignorant, as we both were, I am sure that it was none too long. Never shall I forget the surprise I felt, to say nothing of the delight, when I discovered that my sweetheart was as anxious to find out the uttermost facts about me as I was to explore the divine mystery of her sweet body. We lived in different towns, and I used to spend Sundays at her home. I slept in a room adjoining that occupied by my betrothed and a friend. There was a transom with clear glass over the door which connected these 2 rooms, and to have stood upon the foot of the bed and looked through this transom would have been the easiest thing in the world, and was such an opportunity as I would have given years of my life to have obtained in my adolescence. But now that the chance was afforded me to freely spy upon the chamber of my future bride, my soul revolted, for the feeling was upon me that not until it was revealed to me, because she could no longer bear to keep it concealed from me, would I look upon the blessed vision of her maiden loveliness. Nor was I disappointed, for gradually we became acquainted with each other's bodies, and this gradual unveiling of each to the other led during the last months of our engagement to mutual manual manipulations. Excitement and gratification intercourse did not take place until the 2nd night after our marriage, and our first baby was born 9 months and 3 days after our marriage, though my wife was 10 days past the cessation of her period at the time of my first entering. Since marriage, I have made it my first duty to study my wife's inclinations and desires with regard to our sexual relations, and can say that now, after 7 years of married life, and after she has borne me 2 sons, we are enjoying a fullness of happiness that neither of us would have believed possible during the first year of our married life. I have found that the woman must have the entire charge of the time and number of approaches in a week or month, and that when she is for any reason disinclined to the sexual act, the husband must keep away, no matter how he feels about the matter. Also, the man must be sure that his wife reaches the orgasm, or is at the point of it, before he allows himself to let go. Our meetings have averaged 8 or 9 a month. During the latter months of pregnancy they were nil, and in the month following an enforced separation of several weeks, they were 14. We have never tried nor had the slightest curiosity to know how far we could indulge ourselves. For myself, I seem to demand a gratification of the sexual desire rather oftener than my wife, and when I feel I cannot get a good night's rest without first being relieved of my seminal burden, while at the same time my wife is disinclined to the sexual act, I have her perform manual manipulation. Until relief is effected, mind, I say relief, for the emission gives me very little pleasure under these circumstances, but it does give relief in my present health. I find I cannot sleep well if I go over more than 2 nights without an emission. My wife understands my condition and is entirely willing to assist me in this way when she feels she cannot give me the gratification which I crave. We have come to see sex matters as they are, and respect and reverence have taken the place of ignorance and fear. To sum up, owing to lack of circumcision, the sex instinct developed too soon and out of all proportion during my early youth. I cannot see that masturbation has ever had the slightest bad effect upon my health or mental state, except as I was constantly loathing myself more or less for being unable to stop it. The husband must subordinate himself to the wife in order to obtain the highest good and pleasure of both. I have always been successful in my undertakings, stood at the head of my class at school, and in my professional work graduated with highest honors. I have a memory for prose or verse that is the cause of envy to many of my friends. The facts here set down are recorded in the interest of advancing study along this most important but neglected and ignored line, that they have been truthfully recorded, without favor to the black or light on the white, is my sincere belief. History Roman 19 EB Parents, sound strong constitution in mother, moderately so in father, vigorous and healthy, but of refined nature, breast milk for 6 months. Age 45, took great delight in the little waterworks, severely punished for this interest, in the parts morbidly increased thereby. Age 5, earliest recollection of counter-erection, the penis, shrinking tensely into itself, producing local and general discomfort. This resulted from certain kinds of mauvaise behaving, to kiss aged persons having officious help at micturition, bathing, dressing, etc., which caused a sort of physical disgust toward puberty. The experience grew rare. One such occasion was at about 18, when solicited on the street by a prostitute. The very idea of homosexual relations produces, it would appear to be a powerful safeguard against promiscuous sex relations. I have met 2 men subject to the same thing, and have heard of 1 woman subject to something analogous. It might be called a nausea of the nether heart in Georg Herth's phrase. Age 67, earliest recollection of erection, unprovoked at first, a disposition to punish the organ and satisfaction. In doing so, from this time, erection took place whenever it was thought about. Age 10, present at a discussion in the playground about the best way of intercourse, which I heard of for the first time. This was followed by enlightenment on the source of children. Concluded, it must be very painful to both parties, just the other way I was told. But the idea of pain to the genitals was interesting to me. Pain felt by the other sex was interesting. Pained looks captivated me. I liked to imagine some mysterious trouble. And as I learned more, female complaints interested me greatly in their subjects. I got a grateful pang at the pit of the stomach at the thought. But neither erection, nor the opposite, this hypogastric feeling, has continued to associate itself with certain sexual impressions. The thought of a woman mortifying herself later on excited me sexually. Once pulling a stay string for fun, my wife, never laced, gave me a powerful and quite unexpected erection. Age 12, a girl visitor of the same age got me talking about the genitals, and at bedtime came and proposed coitus. We failed to manage it. The vulva stripped back the foreskin, which was a voluptuous feeling. Then we were alarmed by something and separated. I never saw her again. She too liked to punish her vulva. She put whole pepper in it and advised me to use the same. I continued, greatly excited. When she had gone, the hand flew to the phallus and worried it. An orgasm came on at onset, childish orgasm, consisting of well-spaced spasms of the ejaculators, without the poignant preliminary nisus of the adult orgasm. There was no reaction or depression, except that the phallus which did not subside at onset was painful to touch. A week or so later I tried again, but failed. A month later, being more excited, I succeeded. I found that I could only compass it about once in 3 weeks. There were no emissions. I used to have a spontaneous mental image of a small Grecian temple in a sunny park, which charmed me, and I had no scruples. Age 12-13, masturbated once or twice a month. Age 13-14, was sent to a small public school, where it happened that a very good tone prevailed. I learned that masturbation was bad form and unmanly. The proper thing was to save one's self up for women. At about 18, I dropped the practice easily in spite of indulging my imagination about coitus. I thought of the initiation with prostitutes at 18, with the mixed feelings that even the most combative soldier must regard the fray, the hypogastric feeling, above referred to would come on which I liked and disliked. At the same time, the first occasion on which I remember this feeling was when I got my first braces. Anything that harped on my sex produced it. Every time I received the sacrament, which I was forced to do very young, I repented of my intention of whoring. At 18, as a man must doned afterward, I relapsed to the expectation. Religion was a great reality to me, but it did not produce the radical effect that the development of the romantic sentiment did later on. Both my wife and I became freethinkers at about 30. Age 15-17, read poetry and romance, conceived a high ideal of faithfulness and constancy. What a mockery all this loyalty is, I said to myself. If a man has stultified it beforehand, that was no mere castle building. I had not understood what I was about in expecting to whore. The critical feelings were now awakening, and what they produced was revulsion against the abuse of sex, which got stronger every year. It became plain that there would be no whoring, or the like for me. I was far too proud and fastidious. I neglected my tasks, which were uncongenial, and read a great deal of anatomy and physiology, which stood me in good stead later. As I rose in the school, I was surprised to find the tone worse, but quite at the top it was better again. And with my latest companion's sex was never even mentioned. At 14, I had a friend who importuned me to come into his bed, but I never would get under his bedclothes, for the male sex repels me powerfully in personal contact. He began to talk of masturbation, and now I can understand what he was aiming at, but my daydreams of nymphs and dryads kept me in a state of perpetual tension, and erection was very frequent. The early morbid admiration of delicate women became replaced by admiration of health and strength, combined with grace. Age 17-18, I was given a cubicle in which my neighbor on the right masturbated noisily 2 or 3 times a week, and the one on the left every night, using intermittent friction to drag it out longer. One night, kneeling at my bedside, saying prayers, my attention was divided between these and the occupation of my neighbor, when after not having masturbated for 4 years, critical years of development, the hand flew to the phallus, and pulses pounding through palms and trembling encircling fingers, procured in Walt Whitman's language the wholesome relief repose content. I slept well and had a sense of elation at the proof of manhood, for we boys were anxious about whether we secreted semen or not. The sexual obsession was tempered, and about 3 weeks later, I had my first pollution, angel of the night, as Mantegazza with better sense calls it. From that time on I had pollutions every 2 or 3 weeks, with dreams, sometimes of masturbation, or of nymphs, or quite irrelevant matters. For a time, these gave me perfect relief. Then my delectatio morosa began to grow again, and the phallus would become so sensitive that working about on the belly would liberate the orgasm. Age 18-19, I had kept on persuading myself I was not masturbating, avoiding the use of the hand, but now I dropped this pretense, and frankly conceded the need to myself. I got done with it in a peremptory way, and thought no more of it. I had no evil effects, moral or physical, and my mother would often compliment me on my bright appearance the morning after. At that time, the appetite matured every 7 to 10 days, and though I dreaded the idea of slavery to it, it would have been very hard to forgo it. Headaches, which had begun to plague me from puberty on, grew. Rarer pollutions occurred in between, but were less effectual. I had up to this point accepted the incidental pleasure under a sort of protest, but now I got over that too, and I allowed what I would prefer to call an idioerotism, rather than an autoerotism, its way always picturing beautiful nymphs to myself. Surroundings of natural beauty moved me to this kind of reverie, partly perhaps because I had once secretly observed a lad basking, naked on the sandy beach, and toying with himself. The recollection is wholly unsullied to me happening on one occasion to check the stimulation about 2/3 way to orgasm. I experienced a miniature orgasm like the childish one, but with no declension of the tumescence, and I was able to repeat this maneuver several times before the full orgasm. This I later practiced in coitus prolongatus, giving the partner time to come up. I had already got into the way of poising the feeling on its climax. The ejaculator reflex, being habituated to this, seems to set in with its throbs when the maneuver is simulated, though no semen has yet been poured into the bulbous portion, for the ejaculators to act upon. If this play be broken off before the critical spasms in the American carezza ecther, is no perceptible reaction, though an unsatisfied feeling remains. But when the act proceeds to emission, and the poignant undercurrent of feeling sets in, that ushers the ejaculation, and may only last 2 to 5 seconds. It makes all the difference, and constitutional signs appear perspiration, etc. This leads to the question whether the critical sensation specially involves the sympathetic nervous system. Up to that point, the process is under control, but then automatic. An observation of practical importance to me at that time was this: I awoke in the morning, after a pollution at night, with an acute headache of a specific kind and erection. This had happened before after pollution, and the erection suggested to me whether a hair of the dog that bit me might not prove beneficial, as the excitation preceded the pain in the head was directly drained away, as if I were drawing it out. Other pain is also relieved for the moment, such as neuralgia, but to return soon with interest. This, however, was specific and pure benefit. The next time I got a bad headache of this character without preceding pollution, I tried the remedy at about 10. A Roman 1000, the semen was copious and watery, and the relief was marked, but in an hour's time the headache returned. I had never repeated the act at short interval Roman 1e, while the organs were under the influence of a previous act. And now I tried the effect of that. The second emission was also profuse, but much thicker, and the relief much greater in about 3 hours. The headache was, however, again intolerable, and the connection being now clear, I ventured on a third act, which proved to be the most voluptuous I had so far experienced, the nisus being far more intense. The semen was copious, but thick, and ropey, with lumps as large as small peas, that could scarcely be crushed with the finger, and yellow in color, and rank in odor. After that I was perfectly well, and kept so the urethra was blocked, so that I could with difficulty stroke the masses out. Later, I have examined such semen microscopically, and found the spermatozoa dead and disintegrating. My period in my best years to 48 was twice a week, the odd number being an inconvenience, and I have since endeavored to avoid accumulations, emptying the receptacles on the 4th day when I remembered the interval. Even if the organs did not remind me on the 5th day, headache would otherwise appear, and perhaps 2 acts be needful. Or if I forgot about it for a week, 3 acts running, that I did not abuse the function. The fact proves that every year I would forget about it 2 to 3 times, and have to resort to this drastic mode. But there is quite a different headache that follows on indulgence during convalescence, or when the system is otherwise much lowered. Railway traveling greatly accentuates the need with me. Also, riding girls aroused no physical desire, though I chiefly sought their society, and even after the genital tension was so pronounced up to 20, I was troubled by the fact that women did not affect me sexually. About this time, a buxom girl I liked, and who liked me vehemently, laid her hand on my arm, in trying to persuade me to give up shooting the phallus, leaped simultaneously. That was my first sexual experience, as proof that the nexus was established between the genital mechanism and the complex of feeling we call sexual. Age 24. At this age, I went to stay at a house where there were 2 very pretty girls. I at once lost my heart to the elder Roman 50b, as she did to me. Strong constitution, but refined nature. Parents sound, brought up in the country, 11 months breast milk. What a mother she will make, I said to myself. Now began a time of the spiritual and physical communion that I had pictured to myself. I am 60 now, she is 57. We are still like lovers. No, not like lovers. We are lovers, of course. I do not mean to imply that sexual impressions have preponderated in our life, as they do in this account. Quite the contrary, we are both strong and, according to all accounts, unusually well preserved. We are very temperate. Since 48, I notice a gradual decline of the erotic propensity. It is now once in 5 or 7 days. Since the menopause, her propensity has declined markedly, but it is not extinct, and she delights as much as ever in my delight. She began to menstruate at 12, was regular till 17, then got chlorotic for a few months. Soon recovered, though menstruation was often irregular, but never painful. Sexual experience began at 25. I have often wondered if a moderate self-gymnastic of the faculty in Venturi's sense would not have educated her genital sphere, and made her a still better comrade. Excluded the periods of irregularity and frigidity. The stage of latency was too protracted. We often noticed that when menstruation was due, or nearly so prolonged, love sports at bedtime would be followed by menstruation in the morning. We never were separated for longer than 3 months, and on that occasion, menstruation being delayed, she tried what masturbation would do to determine it, and with a positive result. My need, though less, is as imperative as ever. Seminal headachesses, I would call them, have ceased. Since 50, the accumulation only produces muddle-headedness. But I have not suffered accumulation over 10, to at most 12 days. the quantity of semen is also less. The sensibility of the corpora has declined much. That of the glands is unimpaired. Erection is good. Orgasm takes 2 to 4 minutes to provoke against 40 to 50 seconds. When young it is, in some respects, even more enjoyable, perhaps less intense, but much more prolonged. I have no reaction from indulgence, but I never press it. It always presses me for overaccumulation with headache or muddle-headedness. The wifely hand is more efficacious than the vulva. Even the most vivid dream of coitus fails to compass the orgasm. Now, the peripheral stimulus is essential. In our case, physical and psychical intensity of emotion have gone hand in hand. I have become specialized to one woman despite an erotic endowment. Certainly not meager. The pervasive fragrance makes one adore the whole sex. But my wife does not interpret this homage in a sexually promiscuous sense. We both agree in the principle that if one cannot hold the affection of the other, there is no title to it. Tard says that constancy in love is rarely anything but a voyage of discovery round the beloved object. I am perpetually making fresh discoveries. But her constancy, I mean the high level of her passion, is independent of discoveries. A practical question arising out of the foregoing is whether such semen should be committed to the vagina. Its presence is known to me by constitutional symptoms toxic. It is the last to be expelled, and its degenerate germ cells have no chance against those of the normal fluid, deposited in preceding acts, supposing that to be retained. But it may well happen that the prior emissions only reach the pouch, whereas the last is injected into the womb itself. I have frequently had the sense of the orifices of meatus and cervix matching directly, especially when she had powerful orgasm, including 2 conceptions, and of the semen being sucked from me, rather than occluded in its exit, as also happens, requiring me to relax the urge a little at 18 to 19. The semen of a pollution has left tender red patches, where it dried on the neighboring skin, and deep straw-colored stains in the linen.